Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never told this story publicly before. For most of my life, I kept it to myself, only recently sharing it with my family after all these years. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to put this out there because keeping it bottled up for over 50 years has been exhausting. This happened in 1967 when I was 17. I grew up in a small town in rural Louisiana, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business, and there wasn't much to do on weekends except cruise around in your car or hang out at the diner. That Saturday night in October, I had a date with Melissa Jenkins, a girl from my math class. Nothing fancy, just dinner at the local diner and maybe a drive afterward. The date didn't go well. We didn't click, conversation was strained, and there was this awkward silence between us most of the night. Around 9, she asked if I could take her home early, claiming she wasn't feeling well. I knew that was just an excuse, but I didn't mind. I drove her home, said an uncomfortable goodbye, and found myself with nothing to do on a Saturday night. I wasn't ready to go home yet. My parents would ask questions about why I was back so early, and honestly, I was feeling a bit sorry for myself. So I just drove around town for a while, looking for any of my buddies who might be hanging out somewhere. I cruised past the diner, the bowling alley, even drove by a couple of house parties I'd heard about, but either no one I knew was around, or I didn't feel like explaining my failed date. Eventually, I ended up at Willow Creek Park on the edge of town. It was a small park with a pond in the middle and a quarter-mile walking track that circled it. Beyond the track was dense woods that stretched for miles. During the day, it was popular with families, but at night, it was usually empty. The park technically closed at sunset, but nobody paid attention to that rule, and the police rarely bothered checking. I parked my car, a 1965 Chevy Impala I'd saved up for by working summers at my uncle's hardware store, and just sat there for a while with the radio on. After about 20 minutes, I decided to get some air and stretch my legs. I was all dressed up in my date clothes, pressed slacks, button-down shirt, and these uncomfortable dress shoes my mom insisted I wear. Not exactly hiking attire, but I just planned to walk around the track a few times to clear my head. It was a clear night with a nearly full moon, which made visibility pretty good despite the park having only a few scattered lampposts. The air was cool, but not cold, with that distinct fall smell of leaves and earth. I remember hearing crickets and the occasional splash from the pond where fish were jumping. I'd walked maybe halfway around the track when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a scream, but not just any scream. It sounded like a woman in terrible distress coming from somewhere in the woods. My first thought was that someone was being attacked. The scream came again, this horrible, high-pitched wail that seemed to echo through the trees. Without thinking, I ran toward the sound. There was a trail leading into the woods from the park, and I followed it, squinting to see in the patches of moonlight that filtered through the trees. I shouted, "Hello! Is someone there? Do you need help?" But there was no response, just another distant scream that seemed to be moving deeper into the forest. Looking back, running into those woods was probably the stupidest thing I've ever done. I had no flashlight, no weapon, not even a stick. I was wearing dress shoes that kept slipping on the fallen leaves. But in the moment, all I could think was that someone needed help. The trail forked about a quarter-mile in, and I hesitated. The screaming had stopped momentarily. I took the path that seemed to lead in the direction I'd last heard the sound. After another few minutes of walking, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. The trail had become narrow and overgrown, barely visible even with the moonlight. I wasn't sure which way I'd come from anymore. The trees looked the same in every direction. I decided to turn back, but which way was back? I stood still, trying to orient myself, when I heard something new, a strange chattering sound coming from behind me. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was almost like teeth clacking together rapidly, mixed with what sounded like words in some incomprehensible language. I spun around, peering into the darkness. "Hello? Who's there?" My voice cracked embarrassingly. There was nothing, just shadows and trees. I started walking in what I hoped was the direction back to the park, moving faster now. The chattering came again, closer this time. I turned around again, but still saw nothing. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now, my dress shoes slipping occasionally on the carpet of leaves. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something running behind me. Branches snapping, leaves crunching. Whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. And it wasn't just from one direction. The sounds seemed to be coming from multiple places around me. I stopped and spun around, fear giving way to anger born of terror. "I know you're there," I shouted into the darkness. "Show yourself. I'm not afraid of you." It was a ridiculous bluff. I was terrified, but I hoped that if it was people messing with me, they'd back off if I sounded confident. The response was more of that chattering, louder now, and definitely coming from different directions. It was like being surrounded by creatures having a conversation about me in some alien language. I picked a direction and started walking quickly, no longer caring about finding the trail, just wanting to get away from whatever was out there. I walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. My feet were aching in those stupid dress shoes. My shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air, and I had no idea where I was. The woods seemed to go on forever. Occasionally I'd hear that chattering again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, as if whatever was making the sound was circling around me. Just when I was starting to think I might have to spend the night lost in the woods, the trees began to thin out. I pushed forward eagerly, hoping to find a road or house, anything that would get me back to civilization. Instead, I stumbled into what looked like an abandoned apple orchard. The moonlight illuminated rows of gnarled apple trees, their branches heavy with fruit. It was bizarre finding this in the middle of nowhere. I'd lived in the area my whole life and never knew there was an orchard in these woods. I stood at the edge of the clearing, trying to figure out what to do next, when I noticed movement under the trees at the far end of the orchard. Two short shadows were moving between the trunks, making that same chattering noise I'd been hearing. They seemed to be communicating with each other. As I watched, one of them reached up and shook a branch, causing apples to fall to the ground. The other one scrambled to pick them up. My first thought was that they were children, maybe farm kids from some property nearby who were stealing apples. But something about the way they moved didn't seem right. They were too fluid, too quick, almost like they were dancing between the trees. And they were small, maybe 3 feet tall at most. Curiosity got the better of my fear, and I moved closer, trying to stay in the shadows at the edge of the orchard. As I got nearer, the moonlight gave me a clearer view, and what I saw made me freeze in my tracks. These weren't children. They weren't even human. They were covered in brownish-red hair, like a rusty color, all over their bodies. They had large, round eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight, flat faces with large nostrils, and huge mouths with teeth that protruded slightly. Their arms were long and muscular, reaching almost to their knees. They moved with a strange, graceful agility that was both beautiful and terrifying. I must have made a noise, or maybe they smelled me, because suddenly one of them stopped and turned in my direction. It made a high-pitched yipping sound and pointed at me with a long-fingered hand. The other one turned too, and they both began jumping up and down, chattering loudly to each other. I was frozen in place, unable to run, unable even to scream. What I was seeing simply couldn't exist. It was impossible, yet there they were, two creatures straight out of a nightmare, staring at me from 30 feet away. Then I heard it again, that horrible woman-like scream that had lured me into the woods in the first place. The two small creatures immediately stopped their chattering. They looked guilty, scared. Their postures changed, becoming submissive, heads lowered. And then something even stranger happened. They began to fade, not like they were walking away, but like they were literally becoming transparent. I could still see their outlines, but it was as if they were made of frosted glass, with the moonlight passing through them. That's when I felt it. Hot breath on the back of my neck, and the smell. Dear God, the smell. Like garbage left in the sun for a week, mixed with sulfur and wet dog. It was so powerful it made my eyes water. Slowly, feeling like I was moving through molasses, I turned around. I didn't see a face at first. I was eye level, with a massive chest covered in the same rusty brown hair as the small creatures. I had to tilt my head back to look up at its face. It was at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. A larger version of the two small ones with the same features but more defined, more menacing. It looked down at me with what I can only describe as disgust, its massive nostrils flaring as it took in my scent. Then it opened its mouth, a cavernous, terrible thing lined with yellowish teeth, and let out that same woman-like scream right in my face. The sound was deafening up close, and I felt spittle hit my face. The smell of its breath was even worse than its body, like rotten meat and decay. I still couldn't move. It was like my feet were rooted to the ground. The large creature stared at me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then the two smaller ones appeared beside it, no longer transparent, chattering excitedly and pulling at its long arms. They seemed to be communicating, all three of them making different sounds back and forth. The large one finally turned away from me, making a dismissive gesture with its hand. It didn't see me as a threat. It didn't see me as anything worth bothering with. All three of them simply walked away, deeper into the orchard, without looking back. It was only after they disappeared from sight that my body finally responded to my brain's desperate commands to run. And run I did. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, tripping over roots and branches, my fancy dress shoes forgotten as I sprinted in what I hoped was the direction of the park. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. By some miracle, I eventually broke through the trees and found myself back at the park. My car was still there, sitting alone under a lamppost. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there, gasping for breath, my mind trying to process what I'd just seen. I drove home in a daze and went straight to my room. I didn't tell my parents what had happened. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled the town crazy or accused of being drunk or high. So I kept quiet. I avoided the park after that. I avoided the woods entirely. For years, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination or a group of people playing an elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. As time passed, I researched similar encounters, reading books and articles about cryptids and unexplained phenomena. It wasn't until years later, when the internet became available, that I found others had seen similar creatures. Based on everything I've learned since, I believe what I encountered that night were what some call Littlefoot, juvenile Sasquatch, or Bigfoot creatures, and their mother. They were just gathering food, apples from that abandoned orchard, when I stumbled upon them. The woman-like scream, which is commonly reported in Bigfoot encounters, was likely their way of luring intruders to check on them, or possibly a hunting technique. The strangest part, the part I still can't explain, is how the smaller ones seem to fade from visibility. Some researchers suggest these creatures may have some form of camouflage ability, but that sounds too far-fetched, even for me. Maybe it was a trick of the moonlight, or maybe my terrified mind couldn't properly process what I was seeing. It's been over 50 years now, and I've never gone back to that spot. I couldn't even if I wanted to. That whole area was developed in the 80s. The woods cleared for a shopping center and housing development. Sometimes I wonder if others have had encounters there that they've never spoken about. I don't know why I'm finally sharing this now. Maybe because at my age I don't care so much what people think anymore. Or maybe because I need to know I'm not alone, that others have seen things they can't explain. All I know for certain is that what I saw that night in 1967 was real, and it changed how I view the world forever. Story 2. I've been a hunter my whole life. My dad taught me when I was just a kid, and I've spent more time in the woods than most people spend in shopping malls. I know what animals sound like, smell like, and move like. I know what belongs in the forest and what doesn't. What I saw that day in 2008 near Sims doesn't belong anywhere on this earth. It was mid-October, perfect deer hunting weather in Northern California. The leaves were changing. There was a slight chill in the air. Just cool enough to keep the bugs down, but not so cold that you'd freeze your ass off sitting in a stand all day. I'd taken my sister's boy Jake with me. He was 14 then, and it was his second hunting season. Smart kid, respectful of the woods, knew how to handle a rifle safely. I was proud to have him along. We'd been to this spot plenty of times before. It's about 30 miles outside of Redding, near Sims. This weird mix of pastures, swampy areas, and old cattle grazing land that nature had started reclaiming. Lots of deer move through there, especially in the fall when they're getting ready for winter. We got to our spot around 2 in the afternoon. The plan was to hunt until dusk, maybe bag a deer, then head back to my place for dinner. Simple day, nothing fancy. I got Jake set up in a stand about a quarter mile from the access road. Good spot with clear shooting lanes, where I'd seen plenty of buck activity over the years. I made sure he was comfortable, had his walkie-talkie, water and snacks, then headed to my own stand about 400 yards away. My stand was deeper in, closer to where the pasture meets this boggy area. It was overgrown with all sorts of brush and scrubby trees. Not pretty, but deer love that kind of cover. I settled in for what I thought would be a normal afternoon hunt. About an hour in, everything was quiet. Too quiet, actually. Usually you hear squirrels chattering, birds calling, all that natural forest noise. But it had gone silent in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. Every hunter knows that silence in the woods usually means something's up. That's when I noticed movement in a thicket about 60 yards to my right. At first I thought it might be a deer, but the movement was different. Heavier somehow. Then I heard this sound. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was like a low moan, but not like any animal I've ever heard. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, nothing I could identify. It was deep and resonated in a way that felt, I don't know, almost human, but not quite. My first thought was that Jake had gotten bored and left his stand to wander around. Teenagers, right? So I called out, "Jake, that you?" Not too loud, but loud enough that he'd hear me if it was him. No answer. Just silence followed by the distinct sound of something moving through water. Now, I'm not the type to spook easily. 25 years of hunting will cure you of jumping at shadows, but something felt wrong, really wrong. I got down from my stand, shouldered my rifle and moved toward the thicket, thinking maybe Jake was playing a joke or had gotten himself turned around. As I got within about 40 yards of the thicket, it hit me, the smell. Jesus Christ, the smell. I've field-dressed hundreds of deer, found weeks-old carcasses in the woods, and cleaned up after every kind of animal mess you can imagine. But this was something else entirely. It was like a combination of rotting meat, sewage, and something chemical I couldn't place. So strong it made my eyes water and my stomach turn. The smell alone stopped me in my tracks, but then I heard it. Heavy, deliberate movements through the marshy area beyond the thicket. Something big was moving away from me and fast. I raised my rifle not to shoot, but to use the scope to get a better look. Through a gap in the vegetation, about 50 to 75 yards away, I saw it. Let me be clear, I'm 6 feet tall, 200 pounds. I've hunted bear, elk, you name it. I know big animals. What I saw made me feel small. It was walking upright on 2 legs, not hunched over on all fours like a bear might do occasionally, but walking upright like a man, though with a slight stoop to its posture. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. Its entire body was covered in thick, dark hair, not fur exactly, more like hair about 3 inches long. Even from that distance, I could see the muscles rippling under that hair as it moved. Its build was impressive, isn't the right word. Terrifying is better. Massive shoulders, thick arms, powerful legs. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Too big, too powerful. Its head was rounded with a slight point at the top, and the hair stuck out there in a way that created an odd silhouette against the darkening sky. The thing that struck me most was how it moved through that swampy area. The water and mud there was knee-deep for me, thick with organic muck that would suck your boots off if you weren't careful. But this creature was moving through it with ease, like it was nothing more than a puddle. The raw strength that would take is hard to comprehend. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds as it moved away, putting distance between us with each powerful stride. I didn't raise my rifle, didn't call out. Some primal part of my brain was screaming at me to stay still, stay quiet, don't attract its attention. I listened to that voice. As it disappeared into the denser woods beyond the marsh, I realized I'd been holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the rifle down for a minute. I've faced down charging boar, been circled by coyotes, and had close encounters with mountain lions. Never felt fear like that. It wasn't just that this thing could obviously tear me apart. It was the wrongness of it. It shouldn't exist. Not here, not anywhere. I took a few minutes to collect myself, then checked my watch. It was getting late, almost 5:30, and the light was fading fast. I needed to get Jake and get the hell out of there. I radioed Jake and told him to stay put, that I was coming to get him. I didn't want to scare the kid, but I also didn't want him walking back alone with that, whatever it was, out there. It took me about 15 minutes to reach Jake's stand. Every step of the way, I felt watched. The forest hadn't returned to normal, still too quiet, still that lingering sense of something wrong. I kept my rifle ready and checked over my shoulder so often my neck started to hurt. When I got to Jake's stand, he was still there, looking bored but attentive. He hadn't seen any deer, just some squirrels earlier. He asked why we were packing it in early, and I made up something about bad weather coming. I didn't want to freak him out while we were still in the woods. We hiked back to the truck in near darkness. I walked behind him, constantly scanning the trees around us, my finger closer to the trigger than I care to admit. That swampy, rotten smell seemed to follow us, coming in waves on the evening breeze. Each time I caught a whiff, my stomach would clench and I'd pick up the pace a little. Once we were in the truck with the doors locked, I felt like I could breathe again. As we drove back toward the main road, I asked Jake if he'd noticed anything unusual while he was in his stand. "Like what, Uncle Ethan?" he asked. "I don't know. Anything weird? Strange noises or smells?" He was quiet for a minute, then said, "Actually, yeah, I heard this weird grunting noise coming from the trees behind me. I thought it was a deer at first, but it didn't sound right." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Anything else?" There was this smell too, really bad, like when we found that dead raccoon in Grandma's yard last summer, but worse. Made me feel kind of sick. I figured it was just my imagination or something dead nearby. I didn't know what to tell him, so I just nodded and said sometimes the woods play tricks on you when you're sitting still for too long. He seemed to accept that, and we spent the rest of the drive talking about school and football. That night, after Jake was asleep on my couch, I sat at my computer and started searching. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, cryptids in Northern California. I'd always laughed at those stories, thought they were for gullible tourists and people who watched too many monster shows on TV. I wasn't laughing anymore. The descriptions matched: the height, the build, the way it moved, that ungodly smell. Reports going back decades in those same woods, that same area. Hunters, hikers, campers, all describing similar encounters. I read until my eyes burned, looking for rational explanations, finding none that satisfied what I'd seen. I've been back to those woods many times since that day, never saw it again. But sometimes when I'm deep in the brush and the forest goes quiet, I catch that smell. And I know it's out there, watching me from the shadows between the trees. I don't tell many people this story. Most wouldn't believe me anyway. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a guy in a suit. It wasn't my imagination or a trick of the light. Whatever walks in those woods near Sims isn't human. It isn't an animal either, at least not any animal science has catalogued. It's something else entirely. Something that doesn't fit into our understanding of what should exist in these modern times. I still hunt those woods. I still love being out there. But I never go without my sidearm anymore, and I never stay after dark. And if the woods go quiet and that smell drifts in on the breeze, I leave. Immediately. No deer is worth another encounter with that thing. Jake's 28 now, with kids of his own. He still goes hunting with me sometimes, though not as often as he used to. I've never told him what I saw that day, never explained why we left early or why I was so jumpy on the drive home. Some things are better left unsaid. But sometimes, when we're in the woods together and the sun starts to dip toward the horizon, I catch him looking nervously over his shoulder, and I wonder if he saw more that day than he let on. If maybe he caught a glimpse of what I saw, but like me, decided some things are too impossible to speak aloud. I don't know what lives in those woods. I don't know if it's some undiscovered species or something else. But I know it's real. I know it's powerful. And I know it's watching us more often than we realize. If you're ever hunting near Sims and the forest goes quiet, if you catch that unmistakable stench on the wind, don't stick around to investigate. Don't try to get a picture. Just leave as quickly and quietly as you can. Whatever's out there has lived in those woods a lot longer than we have, and it knows the territory better than any human ever could. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some creatures aren't meant to be found. And sometimes the old legends have more truth to them than we're comfortable admitting. Story 3. I can't believe it's taken me this long to finally write this down. I'm aware of how crazy this sounds, but I need to get this off my chest. What happened to me in the fall of '88 has haunted me for over 30 years now. I've always been a fisherman. Since I was a kid, fishing has been my escape from the world. There's something about sitting by the water rod in hand that just washes all my problems away. Back when I was 27, I lived just outside Decatur, Louisiana. I knew every fishing spot within a 30-mile radius, but there was this one place I always returned to. A quiet bend in the river about 7 miles from town, where the catfish seemed bigger and the world seemed quieter. That day in October started like any other fishing trip. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. The leaves were just starting to turn those rich autumn colors. I left a note for my girlfriend Sarah telling her I'd be back before dinner and loaded up my old Ford pickup with my gear. I remember feeling so damn happy that morning, singing along to Tom Petty on the radio as I drove down those country roads. I parked at the usual spot, a small clearing about a mile from the river. The trail was familiar. I'd walked it dozens of times before, but that day something felt different. I can't explain it exactly, but there was a stillness in the air that wasn't normal. No birds singing, no squirrels rushing through the underbrush. It was like the forest was holding its breath. About a quarter mile in, I noticed something strange that I'd never seen before. Along the edge of the main trail, there were these small stacks of flat rocks arranged in perfect pyramids, bigger stones on the bottom getting smaller toward the top. At first, I thought maybe some kids had been playing out there, but the formations were too precise, too intentional. They seemed to mark some kind of side trail that branched off from the main path. Being curious, I stepped off the main trail to take a closer look. The rock formations continued, spaced about 20 feet apart, leading deeper into a part of the woods I'd never explored. What really got me was how perfectly balanced they were. These weren't random piles. Each stone was carefully placed, with the largest stones on the bottom and progressively smaller ones stacked on top. Some of these stacks were nearly 2 feet tall. As I followed this marked trail, I started noticing other weird things. Branches were scattered everywhere, but they didn't look like they'd fallen naturally. They were snapped clean off, not broken by wind or weather. Looking up, I could see where they'd been torn from trees about 10 feet above the ground. Some of these branches were thick, 3 or 4 inches in diameter. It would take serious strength to break them like that. Even stranger were the saplings. Dozens of young trees, maybe 3 inches thick at most, were twisted and broken at the same height, about 10 feet up. Their tops weren't just snapped off, though. They were bent all the way over, so the top of the tree touched the ground. They formed these perfect triangular shapes, similar to the rock formations. It was like someone had deliberately created these patterns. But who would do that? And why? I should have turned back right then. Every instinct was screaming at me that something wasn't right. But I kept going, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of forestry project or a weird hobby of one of the locals. The marked trail eventually led back to my usual path, and I continued on to my favorite fishing spot. It was a peaceful little bend in the river with a fallen oak that made a perfect natural bench. The river was wider there, and the opposite bank rose steeply, covered in dense forest. I set up my gear, my lucky fishing rod, a small cooler with some beers and sandwiches, and my binoculars. I always brought them to spot fish or watch eagles that sometimes hunted along the river. Then I baited my hook, cast my line, and settled in for what I thought would be a relaxing day of fishing. For about 2 hours, everything was normal. I caught a couple of decent-sized catfish, had a sandwich, and just enjoyed being alone in nature. The earlier uneasiness I'd felt started to fade away. Maybe I'd just been imagining things. Then I noticed something moving on the opposite bank. At first, it was just a dark shape shifting between the trees, maybe 100 yards upstream from where I was sitting. I grabbed my binoculars to get a better look, thinking it might be a bear or a deer. What I saw through those lenses still makes my hands shake when I think about it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. Moving between the trees was what I can only describe as a massive, upright creature. It walked on 2 legs, like a man, but it was covered from head to toe in shaggy, tattered hair. The hair was between 6 to 8 inches long and hung from its body like a ragged coat. The thing was huge. I'd estimate at least 9 feet tall. Its body was massive, easily over 400 pounds, but it moved with a surprising grace. The hair was predominantly black, but I could see white-gray highlights throughout, similar to what you'd see on an adult gorilla that's starting to age. Through the binoculars, I could make out details of its face. It had a pronounced nose, not flat like an ape's, but not fully developed like a human's either. The skin I could see was a uniform light gray color, with sparse hair on the face. I couldn't tell if it had ears or not. They might have been covered by the thick hair around its head. The creature's lips were slightly parted, and I could see its teeth. They reminded me of a German shepherd's, straight front teeth with long, pronounced canines. Each canine looked to be about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. Its brow ridge was prominent, not as exaggerated as an ape's, but definitely more pronounced than a human's, almost Neanderthal-like. The eyes were what really got to me. They were amber-colored and seemed to reflect the sunlight in a way that made them appear to glow. The head was shaped oddly, kind of like a water balloon with a pointed top. While its shoulders and legs appeared somewhat human-like in proportion, its arms were extremely long and covered in the same thick hair. It moved smoothly on two legs, navigating the uneven terrain with ease. The creature was using a large branch like a walking stick, propping itself as it moved along the riverbank. Every so often, it would stop and flip over a rock with the stick, inspect whatever was underneath, then toss the rock aside. It seemed to be looking for something, maybe insects or small animals. As I watched, frozen in place, a smell drifted across the water. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before, a mix of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something musky and animal-like. The stench was so powerful it made my eyes water. For what felt like an eternity, the creature continued its methodical search along the bank, seemingly unaware of my presence. I didn't dare move. I barely breathed. I was terrified that any sound might alert it to my presence. Then it did something that chilled me to the bone. It stopped suddenly and lifted its head, almost like it was testing the air. Then it turned and looked directly across the river. Not exactly at me, but close enough that I felt exposed. It stood completely still for several seconds, and I swear I could feel those amber eyes searching. Without warning, the creature suddenly waded into the river. The water reached only to its mid-thigh at the deepest point. It crossed with purposeful strides, using the branch to test the depth ahead of it. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I was on the same side of the river now, maybe 200 yards downstream from me. When it reached my side of the bank, it paused again, this time turning its head slowly from side to side, scanning the tree line. Then it disappeared into the forest, moving with that same fluid, deliberate gait. I stayed frozen for at least 30 minutes after it vanished. Every sound made me flinch. A fish jumping in the river, a branch creaking in the wind. Finally, when I was convinced it wasn't coming back, I packed up my gear as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely reel in my line. The walk back to my truck was the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to hide that massive shape. Every rustle in the underbrush made my heart stop. I constantly looked over my shoulder, certain I was being followed. The strange rock formations that had seemed merely curious on the way in now seemed sinister, like markers or territorial signs. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got the hell out of there. I drove straight to the ranger station about 10 miles away. The ranger on duty listened patiently as I told my story, though I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He took detailed notes about the creature and the weird rock and tree formations, promising to look into it. I never heard back from him or anyone else about my report. I called a few times in the weeks after, but they always said they were still looking into it, or that they hadn't found anything unusual in the area. I didn't go fishing for months after that. When I finally did, I chose a completely different spot, one closer to town and frequented by other fishermen. I never went back to that bend in the river. I couldn't bring myself to. Over the years, I've tried to convince myself that what I saw was just a very tall man in some kind of costume, or maybe a bear that my frightened mind transformed into something more sinister. But deep down, I know what I saw. The way it moved wasn't human. The proportions weren't right. No costume could replicate that fluid movement or those eyes that seemed to see right through me. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, and some descriptions match what I saw that day. Others don't. I don't know if what I encountered was a Sasquatch or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real and it was intelligent. Those rock formations and the broken trees weren't random. They were signs of something that thinks and plans. I've never told this story to many people. My girlfriend at the time thought I was making it up. My fishing buddies laughed it off as a tall tale. Eventually, I stopped talking about it altogether. What's the point when nobody believes you? but I know what I saw that day in the Louisiana woods. Sometimes I still dream about those amber eyes and wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the creature is standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with that same calculating intelligence I witnessed by the river. I don't have any proof, no photos, no footprints, nothing but my memory, but I know it was real. And sometimes when I'm driving past wooded areas, I can't help but scan the tree line, wondering if it's still out there, stacking rocks and breaking branches 10 feet off the ground. Story 4. I've been hesitant to share this for a long time. It's not that I'm afraid people won't believe me. Honestly, I don't care about that anymore. It's more that I haven't fully processed what I saw that winter morning back in 2012. There are moments when I'm sitting alone at night, staring out my window at the tree line beyond my property, and I wonder if it's watching me the way I watched it. I've been duck hunting since I was 11. My dad used to take me out on cold mornings before sunrise, both of us bundled up in waders and camo, our breath visible in the frigid air. We'd set our decoys and hide ourselves in the brush, waiting for the birds to fly over. If you've never been, there's a certain stillness to those early hours that's hard to describe. It's just you and the slow waking of the world around you. By 2012, I was 37 and had been hunting independently for decades. That particular morning, I decided to head out to Oakwood Wildlife Management Area in northeast Mississippi. I'd been there plenty of times before with my hunting buddies, but this time it was just me and 3 friends, Rob, Mark, and Dave. We'd set up at different spots around this flooded hardwood section, about 60 yards apart from each other, keeping in radio contact. It was January 11th. I remember because it was unusually cold for Mississippi that day. About 28 degrees when we arrived at 5:30 in the morning. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, no matter how many layers you've got on. We'd had heavy rain the week before, and the area was more flooded than usual. The water was thigh-deep in places where it normally would only reach your ankles. The duck activity was pretty slow that morning. After about 2 hours, we'd only seen a handful of wood ducks, and maybe one small group of mallards that never came within range. I was getting impatient, shifting my weight from one leg to the other, trying to keep my blood flowing. That's when I spotted a lone duck flying high, had to be at least 70 yards up. It was a long shot, but I was getting desperate to break the monotony. I took aim and fired. To my surprise, the duck folded and started dropping. From the angle and distance, I couldn't tell exactly where it fell, but I knew it was somewhere in the flooded timber about 100 yards behind me. I radioed to the guys that I was going to retrieve it and would be back in 20 minutes or so. I started trudging through the water, which was consistently around mid-thigh deep. The bottom was soft in places, making each step an effort. The timber was thick there, with large oaks and dense undergrowth of buckbrush and briars. I had to weave my way through, occasionally pushing branches aside with my shotgun. After about 70 yards, I slowed down, scanning the water's surface for any sign of my duck. The water was dark, stained by tannins from the fallen leaves, making it difficult to spot anything. I moved forward more carefully, my eyes trained on the area where I thought the bird might have fallen. Then I saw them. Feathers, just a few at first, floating on the surface of the water. I moved closer, and there were more of them, forming a small trail. But no duck, just those feathers. Something about that struck me as odd right away. If the duck had been wounded and swam away, there wouldn't be this many scattered feathers. If it had died on impact, it would still be there. I stood still for a moment, trying to make sense of it. That's when I first noticed the silence. In the woods, there's always some kind of noise, birds calling, squirrels rustling through the leaves, the wind in the trees. But right then, everything was dead quiet. Even the distant sounds of my buddies had faded. It was as if the world around me was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a rhythmic splashing sound coming from somewhere to my right. At first, I thought it might be one of my friends coming to check on me, but it was too regular, too measured to be someone walking randomly through water. Each splash came at almost exactly the same interval, like a metronome. I crouched down instinctively, moving deeper into a patch of buckbrush. From that position, I could just barely see through gaps in the vegetation while remaining mostly hidden. The splashing was getting louder, which meant whatever was making it was getting closer. That's when I saw something moving between the trees about 150 yards away. At first, all I could make out was a dark shape, taller than it should have been. As it continued to approach, I realized it was moving on two legs, with a distinctive swaying motion that was unlike anything I'd ever seen a human do. Its gait was smooth but powerful, each step deliberate, yet somehow effortless despite the water. I remember thinking maybe it was another hunter, but the shape was all wrong. Too big, too broad in the shoulders, and no hunter I knew moved like that through the woods. They'd be crashing around, fighting against the water and brush. This thing was gliding through, as if the flooded timber was its natural habitat. I stayed absolutely still. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid the thing might hear it. My shotgun was loaded, but it was pointed down toward the water, and I was too terrified to move it into a firing position. Some primal instinct told me that any movement would be a mistake. As the figure got to about 75 yards away, I could see it more clearly, though still partially obscured by trees. It was massive, far taller than any man I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 9 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, maybe 4 feet across. The body was covered in what looked like dark hair, not clothes, but actual hair, uniformly covering its body. At 50 yards, I could see it was muscular but lean, with long arms that hung lower than a human's would. Its legs were powerful, pushing through the water with ease. I couldn't look away. I was paralyzed, not just with fear, but with a kind of awe. This thing didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere in the world as I understood it. When it reached about 30 yards from me, it stopped. I'm not sure if it sensed me or if it was just surveying the area, but it went completely still. I could see its face now. It wasn't a mask or a costume. It was a face with distinct features. Dark eyes set deep under a prominent brow. A wide nose, flatter than a human's. Its mouth was closed, but I could see it was broader than ours. Those eyes are what haunt me the most. There was intelligence there, curiosity even, not the mindless aggression of a predator, but something aware. We stayed like that, locked in a silent standoff, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 30 seconds, neither of us moving. Then it did something I'll never forget. It released this deep, slow exhale, almost like a sigh. I could see its massive shoulders rise slightly and then fall. It was close enough that I felt like I could almost feel the breath displacing the air between us. Then it simply turned away. No sudden movements, no signs of fear or aggression. It just pivoted with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large and continued on its way, moving through the water and between the trees with that same rhythmic splashing as before. Within moments, it had disappeared from view, the only evidence it was ever there being the gradually fading sound of water being displaced. I don't know how long I stayed crouched in that buck brush. My legs were cramping and numb from the cold water, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Eventually, the squawk of my radio jolted me back to reality. It was Rob asking where the hell I was and if I'd found my duck. I managed to respond that I was heading back, my voice shaking so badly I had to repeat myself. When I finally made it back to our hunting spot, the guys took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. Dave asked if I'd gotten stuck in the mud or fallen in a hole. I couldn't tell them. Not then. I just mumbled something about losing the duck and getting turned around in the timber. We packed up early that day. I claimed I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't far from the truth. My entire worldview had been shattered in the span of a few minutes, and I felt physically ill trying to reconcile what I'd seen with what I'd always believed was possible. I avoided going back to Oakwood for about a week, made excuses when the guys wanted to go hunting again. I couldn't sleep properly, kept seeing those dark, intelligent eyes watching me whenever I closed my own. I couldn't talk about it. Who would believe me? I'd always laughed at the Bigfoot stories myself, thought they were just tall tales from people who'd had too much to drink or were looking for attention. Finally, I broke down and told my dad. We were in his garage working on his boat when it just came out of me. The whole story, every detail I could remember. I expected him to laugh or to look concerned about my mental health. Instead, he got very quiet, put down his tools, and sat heavily on an old stool. "I've seen it too, Jake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Back in 1993, bow season, over near Cypress Creek." He described an encounter so similar to mine that it sent chills down my spine. Same height, same movement, same intelligent eyes. He'd never told anyone except my mother, afraid people would think he was crazy. We sat in silence for a long time after that, two rational men trying to make sense of something that defied explanation. A few days later, my cousin Tyler, who works for the state wildlife agency, came over for dinner. After a few beers, I cautiously brought up Oakwood WMA and asked if there had ever been any unusual reports from that area. Tyler gave me a strange look and asked why I wanted to know. When I hesitated, he leaned in and told me something that made my blood run cold. The day before my encounter, January 10th, he'd been called out to that exact same area to investigate what another wildlife officer thought was evidence of poaching. Instead, they found a massive footprint in the mud at the edge of the flooded area. Tyler had actually cast it in plaster as evidence. It measured 22 inches long and showed anatomical details that couldn't be faked. I've been back to Oakwood many times since then, never alone, always armed and always with an eye on the tree line. I haven't seen it again, but sometimes, when the woods get unnaturally quiet and the water is high among the trees, I feel like it's there watching me. I've started leaving a duck or two behind when I have a successful hunt, placing it carefully on a log or stump before I leave. Call it an offering or just an acknowledgement. I'm not sure myself. I know what I saw that day wasn't a bear standing up, wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't a trick of light or shadow. It was something that's been there all along, moving silently through the wild places we think we know. Something that occasionally lets itself be seen, for reasons I can't begin to understand. The next time you're alone in the woods and feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, maybe you're not as alone as you think. And maybe, just maybe, those eyes watching you from the shadows are the same ones that looked into mine on that cold January morning, filled with an intelligence as ancient as the forests themselves. Story 5. I never used to believe in the whole Bigfoot thing. It seemed like something made up for TV shows or to sell merchandise to tourists. I mean, how could something that big exist without us having solid evidence? But after what happened last year, I don't know what to believe anymore. It was early May 2019. I'd been planning a solo photography trip to Wenatchee National Forest for months. As a wildlife photographer, spring is like my Super Bowl. Animals are active, lighting is perfect, and the wilderness feels alive again after winter. I'd researched this particular area extensively and found a remote spot about 8 miles from the nearest access road that promised to be teeming with wildlife. The weather forecast looked perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, no rain in sight. I packed all my gear, my Canon EOS R with 3 different lenses, 2 trail cameras, tripod, laptop for backups, plus all my camping equipment. I'm experienced with backcountry camping, so I made sure I had everything. Bear canister for food, water filter, lightweight tent, the works. I even splurged on some freeze-dried meals that actually taste decent. The hike in was stunning. The trail was mostly dry despite the spring snowmelt, and I spotted fresh tracks everywhere. Deer, raccoon, and even what looked like black bear prints along a muddy section. About 3 hours in, I actually caught a glimpse of a black bear in the distance, which felt like a good omen. I managed a few shots with my telephoto before it disappeared into the trees. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing I'd seen on topographic maps. It was perfect. A small stream-fed meadow with a slight ridge that offered an elevated spot for my tent with good drainage. The trees weren't too dense, allowing for decent light, but there was enough cover to provide shelter and attract wildlife. I set up camp methodically, hanging my food cache in a tree about 100 yards from my tent as a precaution against bears. That first day was everything I'd hoped for. I captured some incredible shots of a family of deer grazing in the meadow, a few interesting birds I hadn't photographed before, and some stunning landscape shots as the sun began to set. I even set up one of my trail cameras along what looked like a well-used game trail. After dinner, I crawled into my tent, feeling satisfied and excited for the days ahead. I connected my camera to my laptop and started reviewing the day's photos. It was around 10:30 at night, and I was about to call it quits and get some sleep when I heard it. At first, it was just a rhythmic thumping sound in the distance. Thump, thump, thump. It reminded me of someone walking heavily, but it was too spaced out for normal footsteps. I paused, taking out my earbuds to listen more carefully. Then the sound stopped. I figured it was probably a deer, or maybe even the bear I'd seen earlier moving through the underbrush. About 5 minutes later, there were 3 distinct cracks, like branches being snapped, but not by stepping on them, more like something was deliberately breaking them. It sounded like it was maybe 100 yards away, and I still wasn't too concerned. Wildlife makes all kinds of noises at night. But then something hit the ground just outside my tent, a heavy thud followed by a roll. My heart rate kicked up immediately. I froze, listening intently, heavy breathing. That's what I heard next. Heavy, rhythmic breathing, uncomfortably close to my tent. I reached for my headlamp, my hand shaking slightly as I turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness of my tent, but I hesitated to unzip the door. Whatever was out there was big, and it was right outside. That's when I saw it against the side of my tent, the impression of a hand, a massive hand with what looked like 5 long, thick fingers pressing against the thin fabric of my tent. The silhouette was unmistakable in the moonlight filtering through the material. My blood turned to ice. No bear has hands like that. No known animal in these woods has hands like that. I held my breath, paralyzed with fear. The hand pressed harder, causing the tent pole to bend slightly. Then it withdrew. I could hear whatever it was circling my camp. Heavy footfalls deliberately placed. Occasionally there was a low, guttural grunt, not a bear's growl, not an elk's call, something I'd never heard before. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to an hour, this thing circled my campsite. Every few minutes something would hit the ground near my tent, rocks or sticks being thrown. One landed directly on my cookware with a loud clang that made me jump out of my skin. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed perfectly still, afraid to make a sound, clutching my bear spray in one hand and my knife in the other, though I knew they'd be useless against whatever was out there. The sounds eventually moved farther away as dawn approached, but I didn't dare leave my tent until full daylight. When I finally mustered the courage to unzip my tent, I nearly threw up from the adrenaline crash. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I surveyed my campsite. What I found made my skin crawl. In the soft earth around my tent were footprints, massive footprints, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They circled my entire campsite. I put my boot next to one for scale. My size 11 boot looked like a child's footprint in comparison. The stride length between prints was enormous, over 4 feet in some places. I noticed several branches snapped about 10 feet off the ground. way higher than a bear could reach standing up. And outside my tent was the rock that had been thrown, not a small pebble, but a smooth stone about the size of a grapefruit. It would have taken considerable strength to throw it from the tree line. I found where the tracks led into the thick brush at the edge of the clearing. Something large had pushed through there, leaving broken vegetation in its wake. I should have packed up right then and there, hiked back to my car, and never looked back. That would have been the sensible thing to do. Instead, I told myself it must have been a very large bear walking oddly, or maybe even two bears. The alternative was too impossible to consider. I decided to move my campsite, thinking that whatever it was had been attracted to the smell of my food or was just curious about the human in its territory. I relocated about half a mile deeper into the forest, in an area with denser tree cover. I figured if it was a territorial thing, maybe moving would solve the problem. That second night was quiet, almost too quiet. I noticed there were fewer animal sounds than the previous evening, but I convinced myself it was just the difference in location. I managed to get some fitful sleep, waking at every small sound. It was the third night when things got truly terrifying. I'd spent the day photographing, trying to distract myself from the previous experience. I'd gotten some great shots of a fox with her kits and was feeling a bit more at ease. I'd even checked my trail camera, but was disappointed to find it had been knocked over. The SD card was missing entirely, which was strange, but I figured it might have fallen out when the camera toppled. I turned in early that night, exhausted from lack of sleep and the constant tension. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. The forest was dead silent, no insects chirping, no nocturnal birds, nothing. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive. Then it started. Hard, deliberate knocks against trees. Knock, pause, knock, knock, almost like a pattern. They seemed to be coming from all around me, as if something was circling again, but at a greater distance. I'd heard about wood knocking in some of those Bigfoot shows, but had always laughed it off as nonsense. I wasn't laughing now. The knocks were followed by a cry that made the hair on my arms stand up. It started low and rose to a high-pitched wail that echoed through the trees. Not an animal sound I recognized, not a sound I ever want to hear again. I didn't even pretend to sleep that night. I sat upright, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. By the time the first hint of dawn appeared, I had already packed most of my gear. I left as soon as it was light enough to see the trail, abandoning my original plan to stay 2 more days. The hike out was 8 miles of pure terror. Twice I heard heavy movement in the brush behind me. Once I clearly sensed something paralleling my path along a ridge to my right. I caught glimpses of something dark moving between trees, always just at the edge of clear vision. I hiked faster than I ever have before, barely stopping to rest. When I finally reached the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon, I nearly collapsed from relief. My legs were like jelly as I threw my pack into my car and locked the doors. It wasn't until I was on the main highway that I finally felt safe enough to breathe normally. I never published the photos from that trip. I couldn't bring myself to sort through them, knowing they'd just bring back the terror I felt. But there was one image I kept. The only usable frame from my second trail camera, the one that hadn't been disturbed. I'd set it up at my new campsite as a precaution. The image is blurry, motion-activated cameras aren't great at night, but it clearly shows a massive, dark-haired figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It's at least 8 feet tall, with proportions that don't match any known animal. The camera caught it looking directly at my tent. I've shown the photo to exactly 2 people, my brother and my best friend. My brother thinks it's a bear standing oddly in poor light. My friend didn't say much, but he cancelled his own solo camping trip the following weekend. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what happened, to convince myself it was just a bear, or my imagination running wild. But those footprints weren't bear prints. That hand against my tent wasn't a bear paw. And that cry, I still hear it in my nightmares. I haven't gone back to Wachi National Forest since. I've barely done any solo trips at all. When I do camp now, it's in popular areas with lots of other people around. My camera gear still gets used, but mostly for birds in my local park or landscapes shot from roadside viewpoints. I don't know what was out there in those woods. I can't explain it, and I don't really want to try anymore. All I know is that something intelligent and massive was aware of me, was curious about me, and for whatever reason, decided to let me leave its territory intact. I don't plan to test its patience with a return visit. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear wood knocks in the distance, or feel the phantom impression of something watching me through the walls. And I wonder if something followed me home from those woods, not physically, but in my mind. A fear I can't shake. A certainty that the wilderness holds secrets we're not meant to uncover. I used to think people who claimed Bigfoot encounters were attention seekers or confused individuals who misidentified bears. Now, I don't share my story much because I know exactly how it sounds, but I know what I experienced, and I know I'm never going back to find out more. Story 6. I've never been a big believer in the paranormal. Ghost stories, UFO sightings, Bigfoot. I always chalk them up to overactive imaginations or misidentifications. It's easy to judge those people when you've never experienced anything yourself. But after what happened near Beaver Lake back in 2004, I no longer have the luxury of that skepticism. It happened on September 25th, 2004. I remember the date clearly because it was my buddy Travis's birthday weekend. We'd planned this ATV trip for weeks. Me, Travis, his brother Kyle, and our friend Derek. We all grew up in Rogers, Arkansas, and spent most weekends exploring the backwoods around Beaver Lake. The area is beautiful in late September, the leaves just starting to turn, the suffocating summer humidity finally backing off. That morning, we loaded up our ATVs and gear in Travis's pickup and his dad's trailer. We set out early, around 7:30, wanting to make the most of the day. We had a spot we frequented about 20 miles from the main recreation areas, less crowded and with better trails. The weather couldn't have been more perfect. Upper 60s, sunny, with that crisp fall feeling in the air. We arrived at our usual parking spot around 8:15, unloaded the ATVs, and were hitting the trails by 9. The first few hours were exactly what you'd expect, racing each other through mud puddles, taking jumps off small hills, stopping occasionally to drink some water or grab an energy bar from our packs, normal stuff. Looking back, there was nothing unusual about the morning or early afternoon. Around 3 o'clock, we decided to explore a new trail system we'd heard about from some locals. It was supposed to have some challenging terrain and connect back to the main trail network eventually. The new area was more heavily wooded and had these steep hills with narrow paths cutting between them. The riding was more technical, lots of roots, rocks, and tight turns. We were having a blast. By 5:30, the sun was getting low. In those woods, it gets dark quick once the sun starts setting. We figured we had about an hour of good light left and decided to head back to the truck. Travis thought he knew a shortcut that would get us there faster, so we followed him onto this narrow path that wound down into a valley. I was leading our group at this point. Travis had fallen behind after stopping to adjust something on his ATV, so I was breaking trail. The path descended pretty steeply for about half a mile, turning sharply between trees and rock formations. When I reached the bottom, I found myself at an intersection with an old dirt logging road that cut across the valley. I stopped and killed my engine, waiting for the others to catch up. They were taking their time, and I could hear their engines revving as they navigated the steep descent. While waiting, I took off my helmet and gloves, feeling the cool evening air on my sweaty face. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. Usually these woods are full of sounds, birds, squirrels, the rustle of leaves. But at that moment, there was this strange stillness that I didn't register as unnatural until later. The sun was low on the horizon, creating these long beams of golden light that cut through the trees on the other side of the dirt road. It was actually really beautiful, the kind of natural lighting photographers dream about. I was just taking it all in, catching my breath, when I noticed movement about 50 yards away, just inside the tree line across the road. At first, I thought it was a hiker. The figure was moving between the trees, partially obscured by the shadows and filtered sunlight. But something about the way it moved caught my attention. It wasn't the casual stride of someone walking a trail. The movements were deliberate, almost cautious, with these incredibly long steps that covered ground in a way that seemed off. As my eyes adjusted to the contrast between the bright sunbeams and deep shadows, I realized whatever I was looking at was massive. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but no, it was moving too smoothly, too consistently upright, and it was tall. Impossibly tall. I'm 6 feet myself, and this thing had to be at least 7 or 8 feet high. The sun was behind it from my perspective, which made it difficult to make out details, but I could clearly see its silhouette. Broad shoulders tapering to a narrower waist, long arms that hung lower than a human's would, and a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. It was covered in something dark, hair or fur, that caught the sunlight in places, giving off a reddish-brown tint. What struck me most was how it moved, not lumbering or awkward, like you'd expect from something that big, but with this fluid, athletic grace. Each step was purposeful, its arms swinging subtly with the rhythm of its stride. It moved like it knew exactly where it was going and was in no particular hurry to get there. I sat frozen on my ATV, my mind racing to process what I was seeing. I remember thinking that I should call out to it or start my engine, do something to alert it to my presence, but I couldn't make myself move or speak. It wasn't exactly fear that paralyzed me, more like a state of complete disbelief and fascination. The creature stopped suddenly, its head turning slightly toward me. Though I couldn't see its face clearly in the shadows, I felt with absolute certainty that it was looking directly at me. A chill ran down my spine, and my mouth went dry. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other across that dirt road. Then the spell was broken by the sound of approaching ATVs. My friends were finally catching up, their engines echoing through the trees. The creature's head snapped in the direction of the noise, and in 3 long strides it disappeared deeper into the forest, moving with surprising speed for something so large. Kyle was the first to reach me, pulling up alongside and shutting off his engine. "What's up, man? Engine trouble?" he asked, noticing my helmet was off. I pointed across the road, my hand slightly shaking. "I just saw something over there, in the trees." "What, like a deer or something?" Kyle squinted toward where I was pointing. "No, it was huge, walking on 2 legs, I think it might have been a Bigfoot or something." The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Kyle's face broke into a grin, and he called back to Travis and Derek. "Hey guys, Marcus says he saw Bigfoot." The joke started immediately. "Did he offer you beef jerky? Was he taking pictures of you with his Bigfoot camera? Did you get his autograph?" They were relentless, exactly as you'd expect from a group of 20-something guys. "I'm serious," I insisted, but my voice lacked conviction even to my own ears. How could I explain what I'd seen when I was still trying to process it myself? It was tall, covered in dark hair, walking upright. "Probably just a black bear," Travis offered, more kindly than the others. "They stand up sometimes, and the light's getting weird with the sunset." I wanted to argue, to make them understand that what I'd seen wasn't a bear or a person or a trick of the light. But the more I tried to describe it, the more my own certainty wavered. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? The creature had been partially obscured by shadows and trees. The sun had been in my eyes. Maybe my mind had filled in gaps with something impossible rather than something mundane. "Look, the truck's still another 40 minutes away," Derek said, checking his watch. "We should get moving before it gets dark." So we did. I put my helmet back on and started my ATV, taking one last look at the tree line where the creature had vanished. The forest looked completely normal now, peaceful even, with nothing to suggest the extraordinary thing I'd just witnessed. The ride back was awkward. The guys kept making Bigfoot jokes, asking if I'd been into Travis's secret whiskey stash or if I was auditioning for one of those monster hunting TV shows. I eventually stopped responding, pretending to laugh it off while my mind replayed the encounter over and over, trying to make sense of it. By the time we loaded up the ATVs and headed home, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a mistake. Almost. But there was this nagging certainty in the back of my mind. The fluid way it moved, the impossible height, the intelligence I sensed in how it observed its surroundings. None of that matched any animal I knew lived in those woods. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that silhouette whenever I closed my eyes. I got out of bed around 2 in the morning and went to my computer. For the next few hours, I researched Bigfoot sightings in Arkansas, specifically around the Ozarks and Beaver Lake area. What I found shocked me. Dozens of reports spanning decades, many describing encounters similar to mine. People reported seeing tall, hair-covered bipedal creatures moving through forests, often at dusk or dawn, usually alone, usually just for a brief moment before they disappeared. The next day, I drove back out to the area by myself. I told myself I was just going hiking, but I knew what I was really doing, looking for evidence, for tracks, for something to validate what I'd seen. I found the dirt road intersection easily enough, but there was nothing unusual there. No footprints, no broken branches, no hair snagged on trees. Just a normal stretch of Arkansas woodland. I never told anyone else about what happened. Not my girlfriend at the time, not my family, not my co-workers. The ridicule from my friends was enough to keep me quiet. But in the years since, I've become something of a silent researcher. I've read every book I could find on the subject, joined online forums where people share their experiences, even attended a couple of Bigfoot conferences, using vacation days I told everyone were for fishing trips. What I've discovered is there's a whole community of normal, rational people who've had experiences they can't explain. Engineers, teachers, police officers, forest rangers, people who know the outdoors, who aren't prone to fantasy or exaggeration. Their stories share common elements that match what I saw. The height, the fluid movement, the obvious intelligence, the way these creatures seem to vanish despite their size. It's been 19 years since that day at Beaver Lake, and I've never had another encounter. Sometimes I wonder if I ever will. Part of me hopes I do, that I'll get a second chance, maybe with a camera ready this time. Another part of me is relieved. There was something profoundly unsettling about looking at a creature that shouldn't exist, something that challenges everything you think you know about the world. I can't prove what I saw. I don't have footprint casts or hair samples or blurry photos. All I have is the memory of those few moments, the stillness of the forest, the golden light streaming through the trees, and the impossible silhouette moving with purpose across my field of vision. It wasn't long enough for me to catalogue every detail, but it was long enough to know that whatever I saw wasn't human, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything that's supposed to be in those Arkansas woods. The skeptic I used to be would say, my mind played tricks on me, that I saw a bear or a person and transformed it into something extraordinary. Maybe that's true. But I don't think so. There was a weight to the experience, a reality that I can still feel when I close my eyes and put myself back at that dirt road intersection. I still ride ATVs in those woods sometimes. I still enjoy the trails and the scenery, but I never go alone anymore, and I always find myself scanning the tree lines, especially when the sun starts to set and those long shadows stretch across the forest floor. Not out of fear exactly, but out of a strange kind of hope mixed with respect. I believe there are things in this world we don't understand yet. Things that have always been there, living alongside us, usually unseen. I was lucky, or maybe unlucky, enough to catch a glimpse of one. And once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to being the person you were before, the person who was certain they knew how the world worked. Sometimes I envy that person, the Marcus who would have laughed at a Bigfoot story, who had the comfort of certainty. But mostly, I'm grateful. How many people go through their entire lives without experiencing something truly inexplicable, something that cracks open the universe and shows them how vast and mysterious it really is? I saw something impossible walking through those trees 19 years ago. And even now, I sometimes wake up from dreams where I'm sitting on that ATV again, watching that tall figure move with unnatural grace through the forest, wondering if it's watching me too. Story 7. I've debated for years whether to share this. Some of you will think I'm crazy or making this up. That's fine. I probably would too if I hadn't been there. This happened in the summer of 1994, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was 22 then, just finished college, and had this beat-up Ford Ranger that somehow got us everywhere we needed to go. That night, me, Mike, Tyler, and Daniel were heading back from a fishing trip at Beaver Lake. We'd stayed way later than planned, typical for us back then. Daniel was driving since my truck was acting up, and I was sprawled in the passenger seat while Tyler was half asleep in the tiny back seat. It must have been around 1:30 in the morning, maybe closer to 2. Highway 62 between Beaver Lake and Eureka Springs is pitch black at night. I mean properly dark. This was before they added more streetlights, and the road winds through these dense woods with these sharp curves that seem to come out of nowhere. We had the windows down because Daniel's AC was garbage, and all you could hear was the cicadas and the tires on the road. We weren't drunk or high or anything, just tired. We'd caught exactly 2 fish all day, which had become a running joke between us. I remember we had the radio on low, some classic rock station that kept cutting in and out with static. We were coming around one of those blind curves. You know, the one about 15 miles outside Eureka, with the guardrail on one side and the steep drop on the other. Daniel wasn't going fast, maybe 45 or 50. The headlights swept across the tree line as we turned, and that's when we saw it. At first, it was just this tall shape at the edge of the trees. My brain tried to process it as a person, maybe some hiker who'd gotten lost. But then the headlights fully hit it, and everything just stopped. It immediately raised its hands to its face, like the light hurt its eyes. That's the detail that still gets me. Such a human reaction. It was tall, really tall. Standing on the slight embankment off the road, I initially thought maybe 6 feet, but when it stepped back slightly and I saw its full height against the trees, I realized it had to be at least 7 feet, probably closer to 8. And it was entirely covered in this coarse-looking brown hair, not fur exactly, more like long hair, no clothes, nothing artificial at all. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms hung down nearly to its knees, and despite its height, it wasn't bulky like you'd expect from something that size. It was lean, almost lanky, but you could tell it was powerful. Its shoulders were broad, but not like a bodybuilder, more like someone naturally built for strength. The face is what I remember least clearly. When the lights hit it, it raised those long arms so quickly to shield itself that I mostly saw its body. But I caught a glimpse of a wide, flat nose and deep-set eyes. Not animal eyes. There was something in them, Awareness, confusion, maybe fear. I don't know. Daniel didn't stop, none of us even suggested it. He just kept driving, maybe a little faster, and for what felt like forever, nobody said anything. I was pressed against the seat, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Tyler had jolted forward between the seats, his hand gripping my shoulder so tight it actually left marks. "Did you guys?" Daniel finally said, his voice higher than normal. "Yeah," I managed to say. "Yeah, we saw it." Tyler just kept saying, what the fuck, over and over under his breath. We drove another 10 minutes in almost complete silence before pulling into this all-night gas station just outside Eureka Springs. Daniel's hands were shaking so bad he had trouble turning off the ignition. We sat there with the engine off, the fluorescent lights of the gas station making everything seem surreal. "That wasn't a bear," Tyler finally said. "Bears don't stand like that." "Not a person either," I added. "No way." Daniel was rubbing his face hard, like he was trying to wake himself up. "It was a Sasquatch, a fucking Bigfoot, right there, right on Highway 62. When he said it out loud, I expected to laugh, or for it to sound ridiculous, but it didn't. That's exactly what it was. There wasn't another explanation that fit what we'd seen. We ended up sitting in that gas station parking lot for almost 2 hours, going over every detail, trying to convince ourselves we'd seen something else. A bear standing weird, a tall guy in a costume. But none of that made sense. Why would someone be in a costume in the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning? And bears don't shield their eyes with their hands like that. The way it moved wasn't like an animal. When it stepped back, there was this fluid grace to it. No lumbering, no awkwardness. It moved like something that belonged there. Something that knew those woods better than any human could. We tried to piece together how tall it actually was. The slope it was standing on probably made it look shorter at first. But when it stepped back, we got a better sense of its true height. Daniel kept saying it had to be close to 8 feet, and he's usually pretty good with that kind of estimation. Its hands were what convinced me it wasn't some guy in a suit. They were huge, with long fingers, definitely hands, not paws. When it raised them to block the light, I could clearly see the shape of the fingers spread out. They looked almost human, but longer, more powerful. We debated going back. Tyler actually wanted to, which surprised me since he was the most freaked out initially. But Daniel and I shot that down immediately. What would we even do if we found it again? And what if it wasn't alone? The thought of there being more of them out there in those dark woods made my skin crawl. We finally decided to continue to Eureka Springs. None of us felt like being on that dark highway anymore. We got a cheap motel room and stayed up most of the night talking about it. I don't think any of us slept more than an hour. The next day, everything felt different. In the daylight, doubt started creeping in. Had we really seen what we thought we saw? Could it have been something else? We even drove back to that spot in the morning, but of course there was nothing there. No footprints that we could find, no broken branches, nothing disturbed. Just the normal woods alongside the highway. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. I kept replaying that moment in my head, the headlights sweeping across the trees and suddenly revealing this impossible figure. I'd always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories. I thought they were just tall tales made up by attention seekers or people who'd mistaken bears for something else. But after that night, I couldn't be so sure anymore. We agreed not to tell anyone at first. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy or like we were making up stories for attention. But eventually I told my brother, who'd always been into cryptid stuff. He was the one who encouraged me to report it, but I never did. The official channels all seemed like they'd dismiss it immediately, and I didn't want to become that guy who claimed to see Bigfoot. About 2 months after it happened, Tyler called me in the middle of the night. He'd been driving that same stretch of road alone and swore he saw something moving in the trees in the exact same spot. He didn't get a clear look, just movement. but he was convinced it was the same creature. He was pretty shaken up. Daniel was the most affected by it. He'd always been the rational one in our group, the guy who could explain anything, but he couldn't explain this. For a while, he got really into Bigfoot research, reading everything he could find, comparing our experience with other sightings. He said our description matched a lot of the credible reports, the height, the proportions, the behavior, especially the fact that it didn't act aggressively, just seemed startled by our presence. What struck me was how it reacted to the headlights. It wasn't the reaction of an animal caught in the lights, freezing or bolting. It raised its hands to shield its eyes, just like a person would. That suggested intelligence, awareness. That's what kept me up at night, thinking about those eyes in the split second before it covered them. There was something behind them looking back at us. I've thought a lot about why it was standing so close to the highway that night. Maybe it was crossing the road when it heard our truck coming. Maybe that area was part of its territory. Whatever the reason, it didn't seem afraid of us until the headlights hit it directly. We never saw it again, at least not clearly. But after that night, the woods around Highway 62 never looked the same to me. Every time I drive that road now, especially at night, I feel like I'm being watched, like there's something just beyond the reach of my headlights, moving parallel to the road, watching and waiting. I still go fishing at Beaver Lake, but I always make sure to leave well before dark now, and I'm always more aware of my surroundings in the woods. I listen more carefully, watch the tree line more closely. Sometimes I think I hear unusual sounds, not quite animal, not quite human, but they're always just distant enough that I can't be sure. It's been 29 years since that night, and I've only told this story to a handful of people. Most react with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. A few have shared similar experiences. Tyler, Daniel, and I don't talk about it much anymore, but when we do get together, it inevitably comes up. None of us have changed our story or our certainty about what we saw. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or some unknown species that hasn't been officially discovered yet. All I know is what we saw wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal. It was intelligent enough to react to our presence in a way that suggested consciousness and awareness. That night changed how I see the world. It made me realize there are things out there we don't understand, things that haven't been explained or catalogued or proven to everyone's satisfaction. I don't need anyone else to believe me. The three of us know what we saw. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, still moving through those woods at night, still occasionally venturing close to the highway. I wonder if it remembers us as clearly as we remember it. I wonder if it tells stories about the strange, hairless creatures it saw in the metal box with the bright lights. I drive that stretch of Highway 62 maybe 4 or 5 times a year now, and every single time, as I approach that particular curve, I slow down a little, just in case. Story 8. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 2 years now. I guess I'm still trying to process what happened that night in April of 2021. Writing this down might help me make sense of it all, or at least get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar and won't think I'm completely out of my mind. My friend Rachel and I had been planning a weekend getaway to the Clearwater wilderness for months. We're both experienced hikers and have done plenty of overnight trips together. So this wasn't anything out of the ordinary for us. We specifically chose this area south of Mount Rainier because it's less traveled than the more popular trails. The tourism around Rainier can get ridiculous in the warmer months, and we wanted actual solitude, not the kind where you're sharing a secluded viewpoint with 20 other hikers taking Instagram photos. We'd been to this general area once before, about a year earlier, and found this perfect little clearing near a hidden pond that wasn't on most maps. It was about 4 miles in from the Summit Lake trailhead, and you had to go slightly off trail to find it. Nothing dangerous or irresponsible. We both use GPS and know what we're doing, but just enough to ensure we wouldn't have neighbors. The weather that weekend was perfect hiking weather. Spring had fully arrived, and most of the snow had melted, except on the higher elevations. It was warm enough during the day that we could hike comfortably in light layers, but cool enough that we wouldn't be dripping sweat on the uphill sections. We got a late start on Friday morning because Rachel got held up with a last-minute work call, so we didn't hit the trailhead until around noon. The hike in was beautiful. Everything was so green and alive. Wildflowers were starting to pop up along the trail, and the air had that fresh, earthy smell that you only get in the mountains during spring. We reached our spot around 4 in the afternoon and immediately set about making camp. That's when I first noticed something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. Rachel was chatting about her new promotion and how her boss had almost derailed our trip, but I kept getting distracted, looking around the clearing. "Kayla, hello, are you even listening to me?" Rachel waved her hand in front of my face as I stared off into the trees. "Sorry, does it seem unusually quiet to you?" I asked her. Rachel paused and listened. "I can hear birds," she said with a shrug. She was right. There were bird calls, but they seemed distant, like they were coming from everywhere except our immediate area. The clearing itself felt strangely still. I brushed it off as my imagination and went back to setting up our tent. By the time darkness fell, we had our camp nicely arranged, tent pitched, fire ring prepared, and our food hanging from a tree branch away from our sleeping area, standard bear precaution. We cooked a simple dinner of dehydrated pasta and sat by the fire, sipping the whiskey Rachel had insisted on bringing for warmth. That's when the silence really became noticeable. The breeze that had been rustling the trees all afternoon suddenly stopped. The frogs that should have been going crazy near the pond were completely silent. Even the small stream that fed into the pond seemed muffled somehow. "Okay, now I hear it," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Or rather, I don't hear anything. "Weird, right?" I replied, trying to keep my tone casual while fighting the growing uneasiness in my stomach. "Maybe a predator is nearby, a cougar or something," Rachel suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. We tried to shake off the strange atmosphere by talking about normal things. Work, Rachel's on-again, off-again relationship with her boyfriend, my classes for my master's program. Eventually, we retreated to our tent around 10, both of us feeling exhausted after the hike. We continued talking in the tent, our headlamps creating a small bubble of light in the darkness. The silence outside had become so complete that our voices seemed too loud, despite speaking almost in whispers. It must have been around 11 when we heard it. Footsteps entering the clearing. Heavy footsteps. The sound was unmistakably bipedal. A rhythmic pattern of left-right, but much too heavy for a human. Each step made a soft thud that I could feel more than hear, like the ground was absorbing most of the impact. Rachel grabbed my arm so hard, her nails dug into my skin. We both froze mid-sentence. Then came a sound that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. A long, drawn-out exhale, like someone breathing out after holding their breath for a long time. Except it was deeper and longer than any human breath could be. "What the fuck is that?" Rachel mouthed silently, her eyes wide with fear. I shook my head minutely, afraid that any movement might draw attention to us. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps continued, moving around the edge of the clearing before approaching our tent. The sound changed as the creature, I couldn't think of it as a person anymore, moved from the leafy forest floor to the pine needles surrounding our campsite. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then a strange dragging sound, like it was deliberately sliding one foot across moss. We sat paralyzed as the footsteps came to a stop right outside our tent. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then slowly, something pressed against the side of the tent, a hand, but impossibly large. I could make out the spread fingers through the nylon, spanning a width that no human hand could cover. 5 distinct digits splayed out, pressing firmly enough to stretch the fabric without tearing it. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hand withdrew. Rachel and I still hadn't moved a muscle. I was afraid to even breathe. What came next sent ice through my veins. A growl, deep, resonant and deliberate, filled the clearing around us. It wasn't explosive like a bear's warning growl. This was controlled, almost calculated. It started low, built to a threatening rumble, then tapered off. It felt like a warning. The distinct footsteps began again, circling our tent. As it moved, I could hear something being dragged along the ground. It completed 3 full circles around us, each one seeming to tighten slightly. Then it stopped again, somewhere near the fire pit. The next sound was so deliberate it couldn't be mistaken for anything natural. 2 sharp knocks, wood against wood, rang out in the silence, precise and intentional. Rachel was silently crying now, tears streaming down her face. I was torn between absolute terror and a desperate need to know what was out there. The waiting was becoming unbearable. "I need to look," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Rachel shook her head frantically, but I was already slowly reaching for the tent zipper. I pulled it down just enough to create a tiny opening, then pressed my eye to the gap. What I saw standing between 2 trees at the edge of our clearing will haunt me for the rest of my life. A massive figure, easily over 8 feet tall, was partially illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the branches. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair, matted in some places. Though it stood upright, its posture was slightly hunched, with shoulders broader than seemed possible. Its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides, the hands extending almost to its knees. I couldn't make out its face clearly. It was turned slightly away, looking toward the pond, but the profile showed a pronounced brow and what appeared to be a flattened nose. It remained completely still, like it was listening or waiting for something. Then it slowly turned its head toward our tent. I jerked back from the opening, praying it hadn't seen me. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely zip the tent back up. "What did you see?" Rachel's voice trembled. "I don't know," I lied, because saying the word that was screaming in my head seemed impossible. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the thing that wasn't supposed to exist. After what felt like an eternity, we heard the heavy footsteps move away, retreating into the tree line. But that wasn't the end of it. Throughout that endless night, we heard distant howls echoing through the valley. Occasionally, more knocking sounds would come from different directions, as if they were signals. Several times, we heard splashing from the pond, like something large was moving through the water. Neither of us slept a single minute. We sat huddled together, listening to every sound and waiting for dawn, with a desperation I've never felt before or since. When the first light finally came, we waited another hour before gathering the courage to leave the tent. What we found outside confirmed that the night's events weren't a shared hallucination. Near the pond, several branches had been broken off and arranged upright in the mud, forming a kind of pattern pointing toward the water. The stones around our fire ring, which we'd carefully arranged, had been rearranged into a straight line. Most disturbing of all, my backpack, which we'd left under the rainfly but outside the tent, had been emptied. Its contents were scattered on the ground. Nothing was missing, but everything had been examined. We packed up in record time, not speaking beyond essential communication. The 4-mile hike back to the car was a blur of constantly looking over our shoulders and jumping at every sound. I've never felt such relief as when we finally reached the parking lot and saw other people unloading their gear from their cars. It's been almost 2 years since that night, but it still affects both of us. Rachel has nightmares about being watched through the tent. She's given up hiking altogether. I still go outdoors, but never alone, and never in that area. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, I get the sensation of being watched, even in busy, popular trails. We've debated reporting what happened, but decided against it. Who would believe us? We have no proof beyond our story, and honestly, I'm not sure I want the area swarmed with Bigfoot hunters and thrill seekers. What haunts me most isn't just what I saw, but the intentionality behind it all. The circling of our tent, the knocking signals, the rearrangement of our things. This wasn't just an animal stumbling upon our campsite. Whatever was out there was intelligent, territorial, and sending us a message. I believe we were allowed to stay that one night in its territory. I also believe if we had tried to stay another, things might have ended differently. Sometimes I find myself looking at maps of that wilderness area, tracing the contours of the valleys and ridges, wondering how many of these creatures might be out there, living in the vast stretches of forest that still remain unexplored. How many hikers have had experiences like ours, but were too afraid or embarrassed to share them? I don't have answers, just questions that keep me awake some nights. All I know is that the forests hold secrets, and for one terrifying night in April, I came face to face with one of them. I keep thinking about that massive hand pressed against our tent, so deliberate, so aware. It knew we were there. It wanted us to know it was there too. And sometimes, in my darkest thoughts, I wonder if it's still out there, remembering us as clearly as we remember it. Amumna. Story 9. I've never told this story to many people. Most of the time when I work up the courage to share it, I'm met with those looks. You know the kind. Like they're trying to decide if I'm crazy, lying, or just saw a bear. But I know what I saw that day in 2003, and it wasn't any damn bear. I was 26 then, living in a small town in northwestern Louisiana. Not much to do around there except fish, hunt, and drink beer with the same folks you went to high school with. Fishing was always my escape. Something about being alone on the water just cleared my head. It was early June, must have been around the first week. The weather was already hot as hell, but not quite the unbearable summer heat that makes you question why anyone lives in Louisiana. I'd been planning this fishing trip for a few days. Wanted to try night fishing in these backwater sloughs, where the Red River meets Old River. Locals said the catfish there grew to monster sizes, and I was itching to find out if the stories were true. I parked my truck about a mile from the spot I wanted to fish. There was this old gravel road that wound through the woods, and I figured I'd walk in rather than risk getting my truck stuck. I had my tackle box, a small cooler with some beers and sandwiches, and my favorite rod. Nothing fancy, but good enough. The road was elevated slightly from the surrounding land, maybe a foot or so higher. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, just the sound of gravel crunching under my boots and birds calling from the trees. The woods were thick on both sides, a mix of pine, cypress, and oak with dense undergrowth. This wasn't manicured forest. This was wild Louisiana backcountry where people rarely ventured. It was probably around 7 in the evening. The sun was starting to get low, casting these long shadows across the road, but there was still plenty of light. I wasn't worried about darkness yet. Had my flashlight for later anyway. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when it happened. The sound hit me first. This loud, violent crashing from the woods to my right, not like a deer moving through brush. This was something big and powerful, tearing through vegetation without any concern for stealth. It was so sudden and loud that I froze mid-step, my heart instantly hammering in my chest. I turned toward the noise just in time to see it burst from the tree line. I still get goosebumps remembering this moment. This massive reddish-brown thing exploded out of the trees about 40 yards ahead of me. It was running, no sprinting, on 2 legs. My brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but it couldn't fit it into any category I knew. The creature was hauling ass across the clearing between the woods and the road. Then, just before it would have crossed the gravel, it changed direction sharply, an athletic, deliberate move, and veered toward the river. The way it changed course made it clear this wasn't some frightened animal running blindly. This thing knew exactly where it was going. I stood there on the road, frozen. Even with me standing a foot higher on the gravel, this thing's shoulders were well above my eye level. And I'm not a small guy, 6 foot even and solid. But this creature made me feel tiny. The closest it got was maybe 25 or 30 feet from me. Close enough that I could hear its breathing, these deep, powerful breaths, and the thud of its feet hitting the ground. Each stride covered an impossible distance. I've seen college athletes run, and this thing would have smoked them all. It was covered in hair, not patchy fur like a mangy bear, but a uniform coat of reddish-brown hair that caught the evening sunlight. The hair seemed shorter on the lower back and longer on the shoulders and arms. It moved with this perfect balance despite its bulk, arms swinging in rhythm with its stride. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 5 or 6 seconds. It crossed my field of vision and disappeared into the thicker vegetation heading toward the river. I never got a good look at its face. It all happened too fast, and it never fully turned toward me. But I saw enough to know this wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I could explain. For several minutes afterward, I just stood there, my fishing gear still clutched in my hands, trying to process what I'd seen. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and my heart pounding in my ears. My first coherent thought was to get the hell out of there, but curiosity overrode my fear. I'd heard whispers about Sasquatch sightings in Louisiana my whole life, stories told by hunters and fishermen who'd venture into the remote areas. But I'd always written them off as tall tales meant to spook outsiders. I set down my gear and cautiously moved toward where the creature had crossed. The undergrowth was trampled, branches snapped clean off rather than bent. I found a clear footprint in a patch of mud, a barefoot but massive, easily twice the size of my boot, with 5 distinct toes. I wish I'd had a camera or phone with me, but this was 2003 and I didn't carry a cell phone fishing back then. I followed the trail to the edge of the thicker brush, but stopped there. Whatever instinct for self-preservation I had left told me not to go further. The sun was getting lower, and the thought of encountering that creature in dimmer light made my skin crawl. I backtracked to my gear, picked everything up, and stood there uncertain. Part of me wanted to get back to my truck as fast as possible. Another part still wanted to fish, as if doing something normal would help me process what I'd just witnessed. In the end, I compromised. I didn't flee, but I didn't continue to my original fishing spot either. I found a small clearing about 100 yards back the way I'd come, close to the road, but with a view of the water. I figured if that thing came back, I'd have a clear path to escape. I fished half-heartedly for maybe an hour, constantly scanning the tree line, jumping at every sound. Needless to say, I didn't catch anything. My hands were still shaking too badly to cast properly. As darkness started to fall in earnest, my nerve finally broke. I packed up and walked, practically jogged, back to my truck, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. I kept expecting to hear that crashing sound again, to see that massive shape emerge from the trees behind me. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the bed, jumped in the cab, and locked the doors. I sat there for a good 5 minutes, just breathing, before I could even put the key in the ignition. On the drive home, my mind raced with questions. What was that thing? Where had it come from? Where was it going in such a hurry? Had it seen me? Was it running from something else? Something worse? I spent the next few weeks researching everything I could about Sasquatch sightings in Louisiana. I found out that the area where the Red River and Old River meet has had reports dating back decades. The old-timers call it the Caddo creature or Louisiana wood ape. The reddish-brown color I saw matches other descriptions from the region. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that what I saw was real. The speed, The way it moved, the obvious intelligence in its actions. This wasn't just some unclassified animal. This thing knew the landscape, knew where it was going. I went back to that spot a few times after that, always in daylight, always with someone else. I never saw anything again, never found another footprint. Part of me was relieved, but another part was disappointed. Without evidence, my experience became just another unverifiable story. What struck me most in the weeks and months following the encounter was how it changed my perception of the world. There I was, in America, in the 21st century, confronted with something science says doesn't exist. It makes you question what else might be out there, hiding in the spaces between civilization. I still fish those rivers, but never alone, and never at dusk. I carry a camera now, and sometimes a gun, though I don't know if I could ever bring myself to shoot at one of these creatures. What I saw didn't seem aggressive. It was just passing through, wanted nothing to do with me. Sometimes when I'm out in those woods, I feel watched. It's probably just paranoia, my mind playing tricks after what I experienced. But sometimes a twig snaps far off in the trees, or I catch a whiff of something musky and wild on the breeze. And I wonder if it's out there, watching. I wonder if it recognizes me as the human who stood frozen on that gravel road 19 years ago. I wonder if it tells its own stories about the strange creature it encountered one evening in the Louisiana backcountry. I've tried to explain it away countless times. Maybe it was a bear with mange walking upright. Maybe it was some survivalist living off the grid who'd lost his mind. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and my eyes played tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw. It was a Sasquatch, a physical, breathing creature sharing our world while remaining just beyond our understanding. I saw it for only seconds, but those seconds changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, I probably wouldn't believe it myself if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw that day near the confluence of the Red River and Old River. And sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself staring out the window toward the woods, wondering if it's out there still, moving through the forests of Louisiana like it has for who knows how long, seen by few, believed by fewer. All I know is that the world is stranger than we're willing to admit, and sometimes the legends we dismiss as campfire stories turn out to be trying to tell us something important about what shares this world with us. Story 10. I've hesitated for years about sharing this, but after what happened to me at Soway River, I can't keep quiet anymore. I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone else has seen what I saw. It was September 2012, and my buddy James Bennett and I had spent most of the night perch fishing at one of those small lakes near Soway River in central Idaho. We're both pretty experienced outdoorsmen, grew up hunting and fishing in these parts our whole lives. I've been in those woods since I was old enough to hold a fishing rod, and James has probably logged more trail miles than most park rangers. We'd had a decent haul that night, nothing record-breaking, but enough to make the trip worthwhile. It was around 3 in the morning when we finally packed up. The temperature had dropped, and that misty chill that comes before dawn had settled in. We loaded our gear into my old Ford F-150 and headed out, taking that narrow 2-lane road that eventually connects to State Highway 93. I was driving, and James was half dozing in the passenger seat. The roads were completely empty. You know how it is in rural Idaho at that hour. Nothing but darkness, trees, and the occasional reflective eyes of deer or other wildlife caught in my headlights. We were both tired but in good spirits, talking about coming back the next weekend if the weather held up. As we approached the stop sign where our road met the highway, I slowed down like I always do. The intersection's in this little dip where 2 hills meet, so you have to be careful coming up to it. My headlights swept across the road as we approached, and that's when I first saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear. There was this tall figure walking down the embankment on the passenger side of the road, but something felt wrong immediately. Bears don't walk like that. James, I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. You seeing this? James, who had been nodding off, straightened up in his seat. What the hell is that? He muttered. The thing was walking upright, completely upright like a person would. But it was massive, built like a linebacker but taller, way taller. It had to be over 7 feet, maybe closer to 8, and it was covered in this shaggy, dark brown hair all over its body. I slowed the truck down even more, partly out of caution and partly because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My headlights were pointing right at it now, and there was no mistaking what we were looking at. This wasn't a bear or a moose or any animal I'd ever encountered in all my years in these woods. The creature reached the edge of the road and then did something I'll never forget. It made this single, long stride that carried it from the edge of the embankment right to the center line of the road. One stride. Had to be at least 15 feet in a single step. It was so fluid, so powerful, like watching an Olympic athlete, but bigger and stronger than any human could ever be. Then it stopped, right there in the middle of the road, and it turned toward us. I hit the brakes, bringing the truck to a complete stop about 50 feet from where it stood. The headlights illuminated it fully now, and I could see details I wish I could forget. Its face was not quite human, not quite ape. The brow was heavy, protruding over deep-set eyes that reflected an eerie reddish-orange in the headlights. But what struck me most was how it looked at us. There was intelligence there, recognition. It knew we were watching it, and it was watching us back. "Jesus Christ," James whispered. His hand gripped the dashboard so hard his knuckles had gone white. For a moment, probably only seconds, but it felt like forever, we just stared at each other, this thing and us. I couldn't move. My hands were frozen to the steering wheel. I wasn't even sure I was breathing. Then it moved again, and the way it moved. I've never seen anything like it. It bent forward, placing its knuckles on the asphalt like a gorilla would, but what happened next wasn't anything like a gorilla. It swung its body through its arms in this powerful, explosive motion, like a gymnast, but with raw power that no human athlete could match. This movement launched it several feet into the air and to the side, where there was a thick pine thicket. It cleared at least 20 feet in that single bound. And then it was gone, vanished into the trees without making a sound. The whole thing happened so fast I almost doubted what I'd seen. But James had seen it too. We sat there in silence for what felt like minutes, the truck idling, both of us staring at the spot where it had disappeared. "Did you?" James finally started. "Yeah," I cut him off. "I saw it." My hands were shaking as I put the truck back in drive and slowly moved forward. We rolled past the spot where it had been standing just moments before. I couldn't help but look at the pine thicket as we passed, half expecting to see it watching us from the trees. "That was a Sasquatch," James said finally, his voice oddly calm. "A fucking Sasquatch." I didn't answer. What could I say? We'd both seen it. That was no bear, no man in a suit. The way it moved, the proportions of its body, nothing human moves like that. Its muscles had been clearly defined even under all that hair, broad shoulders, powerful back, and thick limbs. But it wasn't bulky or awkward. It moved with this horrifying grace. "It looked young," James said after we'd driven in silence for a few more minutes. "I mean, compared to what you'd think, right? Like it wasn't an old one." He was right. Despite its size, already bigger than any human I'd ever seen, there was something about it that suggested youth. Maybe it was the way it moved, or something about its proportions. I don't know. All I know is that it didn't look like some ancient creature. It looked alive, vital, present. "We need to keep this between us," I said as we turned onto the highway. "Nobody would believe it anyway." James nodded. Yeah, you're right." We drove the rest of the way home, barely speaking. What do you say after something like that? We'd both grown up hearing stories about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. Everyone in these parts has. But they were always just campfire tales. Things to scare kids with. Nobody actually believed them. At least nobody admitted to believing them. But we'd seen it, both of us. There was no denying what had stood in our headlights on that lonely road. When I dropped James off at his place, we made a pact not to talk about it. Not to each other, not to anyone. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be laughed out of town, or worse, get a reputation as the local crazies. So we agreed to pretend it never happened. But I couldn't forget. How do you forget something like that? I'd be driving that same road and find myself slowing down near that intersection, eyes scanning the tree line. I'd be in the woods and suddenly feel watched, spinning around to check behind me. The memory of it wouldn't fade. Those eyes reflecting in my headlights, that impossible movement as it launched itself into the trees. For 3 years, I kept quiet. I went about my life, worked at the lumberyard, fished on weekends, had beers with friends, including James, though we never mentioned that night. But I was different. I knew something most people didn't know, had seen something most people would never see. It changed me. Then in October 2015, something happened that broke my silence. I was fishing alone on the Soway River, about 15 miles from where we'd had our encounter. It was getting dark, that time of evening when the light gets blue and the first stars start to appear. I'd been having good luck with rainbow trout, so I decided to stay a bit longer than usual. The spot I was in was pretty secluded, a small clearing on the riverbank with a dense forest rising up behind me and across the river. As the light faded, I heard coyotes start to howl. Nothing unusual there. They often hunt at dusk, and their yips and howls are just part of the soundtrack of these woods. These particular coyotes seemed to be moving down a forested ridge across the water. I could track their progress by their calls, starting high up on the ridge and gradually working their way down toward the river. I wasn't particularly concerned. Coyotes rarely bother humans, especially adults. But then something strange happened. The coyotes went silent. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. One moment they were howling and yipping, the next, nothing. Complete silence. I froze, my fishing rod half raised for another cast. Something had spooked those coyotes, and in my experience, when predators go quiet, it's because they've detected a bigger predator. That's when I heard it. From across the river, roughly where the coyotes had been, came a sound I'd never heard before. It was a loud, sharp crack, like someone had taken a baseball bat to a tree trunk with all their strength. Crack, then another, crack. My heart started racing. Those weren't natural sounds. Those weren't branches falling or trees settling. Those were deliberate strikes. I slowly set my rod down and took a few steps back from the water's edge, closer to my truck parked about 50 yards behind me. And then I heard something else, a deep, throaty whooping sound that echoed across the water. It's hard to describe. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something between a whoop and a howl, but powerful enough to carry through the trees and bounce off the ridges around me. The coyotes started up again, but this time their calls were different, higher pitched, frantic. They were scared. I could hear them retreating back up the ridge, moving fast, and behind them, pursuing them, came more of those wooden knocks and whooping calls. I stood, frozen, unable to move. The sounds continued. Crack, whoop, crack, following the coyotes up the ridge. Whatever was making those sounds was chasing the coyote pack, and it was covering ground fast. The pursuit continued for what must have been nearly 2 miles along the ridge before the sounds finally stopped. When silence fell again, I realized I was holding my breath. My hands were trembling, and a cold sweat had broken out across my back despite the cool evening air. I hadn't moved an inch during the whole episode. It was only when I was hurriedly packing up my gear that I remembered my phone was in my pocket. I'd been recording some notes about fishing conditions earlier and had never stopped the voice memo. When I checked it later in my truck, the recording had captured everything: the coyotes, the sudden silence, and those strange knocks and whoops that had followed them up the ridge. But the recording caught something else too, something I hadn't clearly heard while standing there by the river. Beneath the more obvious whoops were deeper, more subtle vocalizations, sounds that made the hair on my arms stand up when I played them back. Low, rumbling calls that didn't sound like anything I recognized. Not bear, not elk, not any animal native to these woods. I played that recording dozens of times in the days that followed. Each time, I became more convinced of what I'd captured. Those weren't just random forest sounds. Those were communications. One creature signaling to another, hunting together, coordinating. Unfortunately, I lost the recording a few months later when my phone fell into the same damn river during another fishing trip. By then, though, I didn't need it anymore. I knew what I'd heard, and I knew it was connected to what James and I had seen 3 years earlier. After that second incident, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I started by telling James about what happened at the river. He wasn't surprised, said he'd been having his own strange experiences since our encounter, though nothing as direct as mine. Unusual sounds outside his cabin at night, finding large, unidentifiable tracks in the mud near his woodpile, a persistent feeling of being watched whenever he hunted in certain areas. The more we talked, the more connections we made. That intersection where we'd seen the creature was less than 5 miles from a public fishing area with cleaning stations. Places where locals had apparently reported unusual things rummaging through the waste bins at night. The Forest Service had blamed bears, but now we weren't so sure. And that section of the Soway River where I'd heard the wood knocks. Turns out there had been similar reports from hikers and fishermen over the years. Strange sounds, unsettling feelings of being watched, even a few claimed sightings, though nothing as clear as what James and I had experienced on the road. It's been over a decade since that night, and I still don't know what to make of it all. I know what I saw, I know what I heard, but understanding what it means, what these creatures are, where they live, how they've managed to remain so elusive, that's beyond me. All I know is that the woods I grew up in, the forests I thought I knew like the back of my hand, hold secrets I never imagined. And sometimes, when I'm driving that road at night, or standing on the banks of the Soway with my fishing rod, I can feel eyes on me from the tree line, watching, waiting, remembering me just as clearly as I remember them. I don't fish alone anymore. Story 11. I never thought I'd share this publicly, but after 20 years of keeping it to myself, I'm finally ready to tell someone what happened to my family back in 2002. I've read enough accounts on here to know I'm not alone in experiencing these things, but still, typing this out feels surreal, like I'm reopening a wound that never fully healed. We moved to Blowing Rock, North Carolina in late February that year. My husband David had taken a job at Appalachian State, and we found what seemed like the perfect property, an older 3-bedroom home tucked away in a narrow valley about 15 minutes outside town. 3 acres, mostly wooded, with a small creek running along the eastern edge. The nearest neighbors were over a mile away, which felt like paradise after living in suburban Charlotte for years. Our kids, Emma, 9, and Tyler, 7, were thrilled about the expansive yard and the woods to explore. The previous owners had even built a little footbridge over the creek. The realtor mentioned the property had changed hands several times in recent years, but attributed it to city folks, not adjusting to rural life. We weren't city folks, though. David grew up in rural Tennessee, and I'd spent summers at my grandparents' farm in Georgia. We thought we knew what we were getting into. The first few weeks were idyllic. Spring came early that year, and we spent weekends clearing brush, planting a garden, and letting the kids map secret hideouts throughout the property. We even got 2 goats, mostly as living lawnmowers for the back pasture. Everything felt perfect, until it didn't. It started so gradually, I can't pinpoint exactly when. Sometime in March, I noticed an owl call that repeated every night. Living in the country, wildlife sounds weren't unusual, but this was different. It always occurred between 10 and 11 at night, with the exact same pattern and volume. 4 hoots, a pause, then 3 more, over and over. I mentioned it to David, who said owls are territorial and it was probably just claiming its space. But as weeks passed, the call never varied, never got louder when another owl responded, never changed with the weather. It was mechanical in its precision, and it continued through seasons when owls typically change their calling patterns. I started timing it, always starting within the same 15-minute window, always the same duration. Animals don't work like that. By April, Emma was refusing to sleep in her room. She'd wake up crying, saying she felt someone watching her through her window. We checked, of course. The window faced dense woods, and her room was on the 2nd floor. Nothing could see in without a ladder, which would have been visible from the yard. We installed blackout curtains, but it didn't help. Soon, Tyler started sleeping in our room too, dragging his dinosaur comforter to our floor without explanation. In May, we started finding things moved around outside. Tools we'd left in one spot would be somewhere else the next morning. At first, we blamed each other, then the wind, then maybe raccoons. But when David's heavy chainsaw appeared balanced on top of our woodpile one morning, 15 feet from where he'd left it covered under the carport, we couldn't explain it away. Raccoons don't move 60-pound chainsaws. The real nightmare started on June 12th. I remember the date because it was our anniversary. We'd gone to bed around 11 after watching a movie. The house was quiet except for the hum of the AC. Then, at exactly 2:15 according to the bedside clock, the entire house shook with pounding. Not knocking, pounding. Like someone was hitting the exterior walls with a sledgehammer. The windows rattled in their frames. Picture frames fell off walls. The kids woke up screaming. David grabbed his shotgun from the closet and told us to stay in the bedroom. I could hear him moving through the house, checking doors and windows. Then he went outside. Those 5 minutes he was out there were the longest of my life. When he came back, his face was pale. "Nothing," he said. "Not a damn thing out there." We checked the entire perimeter the next day. There were no footprints in the thick grass surrounding the house, no broken branches on the nearby trees, nothing disturbed at all. Our nearest neighbor was over a mile away. There was no explanation for what could have caused that kind of force against our walls. The pounding happened twice more that month, always around 2 in the morning. We called the sheriff after the 3rd time. The deputy who came out walked the property, shone his flashlight into the woods, and suggested maybe it was a black bear. When David pointed out bears don't pound rhythmically on houses from all sides simultaneously, the deputy just shrugged and said, "Weird things happen in these hollers." He didn't come back when we called again. In July, the goats disappeared. We'd had the female bred, and she'd just delivered a kid the week before. One morning, they were simply gone from their fenced area. We spent the entire day searching, calling neighbors, posting on local message boards. 2 days later, I found them, what was left of them, by the pond about a mile up from our house. Just the hides turned almost inside out. No bones, no organs, nothing else. The grass around them was undisturbed, no drag marks, no blood trail. Whatever killed them had carried them there, and I don't even know. It wasn't coyotes or dogs. It wasn't a mountain lion. Nothing native to those mountains could do that. David wanted to leave then, pack up, break our lease, run. But where would we go? We'd sunk everything into the move, and the academic year was about to start. We convinced ourselves it must have been some kind of predator, maybe something escaped from a private collection. We started bringing the kids to my sister's place in Boone on weekends, just to give them breaks from the constant tension. In August, we had some new neighbors over for a cookout. The Millers had just moved into a property about 2 miles down the road. Their kids were around the same age as ours, and for a few hours, Everything felt normal. The adults were on the deck grilling burgers while the kids played tag in the yard. The sun was just starting to dip behind the mountains, that golden hour where everything looks peaceful and perfect. That's when we heard it. I've spent 20 years trying to find words to describe that sound. It started low, almost below the range of hearing, more felt than heard, vibrating in your chest. Then it rose, building into something between a howl and a scream, but with harmonics no human or animal should be able to produce. It sounded like multiple voices overlapping, some deep and guttural, others high and keening. It lasted for maybe 30 seconds, echoing through the valley. The strangest part wasn't the sound itself, though God knows that was unnatural enough. It was how it made us feel. Everyone, adults and children, froze in place. I felt tears on my cheeks without realizing I was crying. Mrs. Miller later told me she felt an overwhelming sense of grief, like something precious had been lost. David described it as primal sadness. The kids ran to us, terrified. Mr. Miller, who'd been in the military, said it came from the woods across the creek, maybe 150 yards away. He and David grabbed flashlights and walked to the bridge, but they didn't cross. Something stopped them. Not fear exactly, but a bone-deep knowledge that they shouldn't go further. After the Millers left, Emma told me she'd heard that sound before, several times while playing near the creek. She'd never mentioned it because it made her too sad to talk about. That night, both kids slept in our bed, and we didn't object. The next day, David found large, barefoot-like prints near the creek. Too big for any of us, with 5 toes clearly visible in the mud. They were already drying out and crumbling at the edges, but he took photos anyway. When he showed them to a biology colleague at the university, the man suggested it might be a bear print, distorted by mud and water. But bears don't have 5 distinct toes that spread like fingers. After that, the kids refused to play outside as dusk approached. We didn't argue. Nights became a jumpy, anxious time of checking locks and windows repeatedly. We'd hear tapping on the water pipes inside the walls around midnight. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm over and over until someone got up and turned on a faucet. The well house was found open multiple times, its door unlatched, despite having a pin that required deliberate lifting to open. Our behavior changed without us even discussing it. We stopped sitting on the porch after dinner. We kept the curtains drawn at night. We no longer went for evening walks. It wasn't fear driving us. It was something more subtle, like an awareness that we weren't welcome outside after dark, that we were being tolerated in our home, but only if we respected certain boundaries. One morning in early September, I realized I hadn't seen our oldest dog in 2 days. We called and searched, but never found him. 3 days later, the younger dog disappeared too. That same week, Tyler's backpack vanished from the front porch where he always left it. A day later, we found it hanging from a branch about 50 feet up in a tree at the edge of the property. No way it got there naturally. The final straw came on September 18th. David had an evening faculty meeting, so it was just me and the kids at home. I'd made spaghetti, and we were sitting at the kitchen table when a rock crashed through the window above the sink. Not thrown through, it hit with such force that the entire window frame splintered. I grabbed the kids and ran to the bathroom, the only room without windows, and called David, then the police. The deputy arrived 20 minutes later and found nothing. No footprints, no other rocks, no evidence of anyone being there. Just massive handprints on the outside of all the doors, as if something had been checking each entrance. The prints were so high up, the deputy needed to stand on the porch railing to photograph them. He didn't stay after dark. We packed essential items that night and left the next morning for my sister's place. 2 weeks later, David drove back with some friends to gather more of our belongings. They did it in daylight and didn't stay long. He said the house felt different, not empty, but watchful, like something was waiting just out of sight to reclaim its territory. We broke our lease and moved to Boone properly. It took months to feel normal again. Emma had nightmares well into the next year. Tyler developed a stutter that required speech therapy. David and I fought constantly, both blaming each other for not leaving sooner, for exposing our family to whatever was in those woods. It was only years later, at a faculty dinner, that David met a wildlife biologist who specialized in Appalachian ecosystems. After a few drinks, David mentioned our experience. Instead of dismissing it, the biologist got very quiet and asked where exactly we'd lived. When David told him, the man nodded and said, "That valley has a history." Apparently, we weren't the first family to leave. The property before ours had been a stone house built in the 1930s, abandoned after the family experienced heavy pounding at night that cracked a foundation built to last centuries. The biologist had collected similar stories throughout that area. Unexplained vocalizations, missing pets, feelings of being watched, and a peculiar absence of certain wildlife. Coyotes, which were abundant just a ridge over, were never heard in our valley. The sheep farm down the mountain had guard dogs that would sometimes appear at properties in our valley, agitated and alert, as if they'd tracked something there. I've spent years researching what happened to us. I've read about infrasound, territorial predators, even obscure psychological phenomena like mass hysteria. Nothing fits except one explanation I've been reluctant to accept until finding this community. What lived in those woods around our house wasn't human, but it wasn't just an animal either. It was intelligent enough to test our boundaries, to communicate warnings, to establish rules we intuitively understood. It mimicked owl calls with mechanical precision. It could move heavy objects. It carried full-grown goats a mile without leaving trails. It made sounds that affected us emotionally in ways that defy explanation. I believe my family spent 6 months sharing our home with a Sasquatch, possibly more than one. Every unexplained incident, every bizarre occurrence fits the behavior patterns I've since read about in credible accounts. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. For most of these years, I haven't even believed myself. I've tried to rationalize it all away, but I can't explain those prints, those sounds, that profound feeling of another intelligence watching us, evaluating us, and ultimately driving us away from what it considered its territory. 20 years later, I still wake up sometimes at 2 in the morning, listening for pounding on the walls, wondering if whatever was in those North Carolina woods is still there, still claiming its territory, still sending families like mine running into the night, forever changed. Story 12. I've never told many people this story. Most of the time when I try, I get those looks. You know the ones. This guy's full of crap looks. But I swear on everything I hold dear, what happened to me and my friend Eric that summer in '91 was real. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was the summer of '91, and I had just turned 16 a few months earlier. Like most kids in rural Arkansas, summer meant freedom. Days spent exploring the woods, swimming in creeks, and generally avoiding any responsibilities. Eric and I had been best friends since elementary school, and we shared this obsession with exploring the caves and hills around Madison County. That particular day started like any other summer day. It was hot as hell, probably in the high 80s by mid-morning, with that thick Arkansas humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin. We had our bikes, some snacks, and a couple of flashlights. Our mission that day was to find something called Turner's Cave. My parents had mentioned this cave a few times. Supposedly, it was this big underground shelter the government had built during the Cold War. You know, one of those fallout shelters where officials would hide if the Soviets ever dropped the bomb. As kids, we thought that sounded awesome. I mean, how cool would it be to discover some secret government hideout? We started at this cave we already knew about, one we'd explored before. It was near an old logging trail about 4 miles from my house. We spent maybe an hour poking around in there, but it was pretty obvious this wasn't Turner's cave. It was just too small, barely more than a rock overhang with a few small chambers. No way the government would use this as a shelter. So we decided to keep looking. We followed this dry creek bed downstream for maybe a quarter mile. It was slow going because we had to constantly climb over fallen logs and push through these patches of thorny bushes. The whole time, we were scanning the hillsides for any sign of another cave entrance. Eventually, the creek led us to what looked like an old logging road. It was overgrown, but you could still see where it cut through the forest, angling up the ridge. We figured maybe the road would lead us somewhere interesting, or at least give us a better vantage point. So we started hiking up it. It was steep in places, and by the time we reached the top, I was drenched in sweat. My t-shirt was soaked through, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back. At the top of the ridge, the woods ended at this rusty barbed wire fence. Beyond it was an open pasture that stretched maybe 100 yards before the forest picked up again on the other side. By this point it was around noon, and we were hot and tired. We climbed over the fence, carefully because that rusty barbed wire could tear you up if you weren't careful, and just flopped down on the grass to catch our breath. The pasture grass was dry and scratchy, but it felt good to just sit and rest for a minute. I remember pulling my water bottle out of my backpack and taking a long drink. The water was warm by then, but I was too thirsty to care. Eric was lying on his back, looking up at the sky, talking about how we should try the other side of the valley next, where his uncle had mentioned seeing some weird rock formations. We'd been sitting there maybe 5 or 10 minutes when I first noticed the sound. It's hard to explain exactly what caught my attention. When you grow up in the country, you get used to the sounds of animals moving through forest leaf litter. Squirrels make a certain pattern when they're running and jumping. Deer make another pattern, heavier, more deliberate. But this sound was different. I can't really tell you why it stood out to me. It was just wrong somehow, like the rhythm wasn't quite right for any animal I knew. It wasn't continuous either. It would happen for a few seconds, then stop, then start again in what seemed like a slightly different location. Eric must have noticed it at the same time because he sat up and looked toward the forest edge behind us. "That's not a squirrel," he said. That had been my first thought too, that maybe it was just a squirrel or two chasing each other through the leaves. We both got to our feet and turned to look at the forest line. The sounds had stopped by then. The woods were dense there, with lots of underbrush and these tall oak and hickory trees that created deep shadows even in the middle of the day. That's when Eric suddenly grabbed my arm. His fingers dug in so hard that I almost yelped. "Look at that," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. I didn't see the whole thing, just an arm and a leg standing behind a tree about 40 feet away. But that was enough. The arm was long, way too long to be human, and both the arm and leg I could see were covered in this brownish-gray hair, about 3 inches long. I remember noticing how the hair had darker roots and lighter tips, creating this effect that helped it blend in with the tree bark. If it hadn't moved slightly, we probably would never have spotted it. We both just froze. I mean, completely froze. I couldn't even breathe for what felt like forever. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard, I thought it might actually break something. Eric whispered, "We need to run." But I grabbed his shoulder and shook my head. Everything in my body was screaming at me to run too, but some instinct told me that was the worst thing we could do. "Don't run," I whispered back. "If we run, it might chase us." I don't know why I thought that, but it seemed important. If this thing was what I thought it was, it could probably outrun us easily. We stood there for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours, just staring at that spot. The weird thing is, I never heard it move away. One moment the hairy arm and leg were visible behind the tree, and the next time I blinked, they were just gone. No sound of footsteps, no cracking branches, nothing, just gone. We waited a bit longer, still frozen in place, before I finally whispered to Eric that we should start walking, not running, back to the logging road. We backed away slowly, never turning our backs to the forest. My legs were shaking so badly I'm surprised I could walk at all. Once we reached the fence, we carefully climbed back over it and continued backing away until we hit the logging road. Only then did we turn around, but we still didn't run. We walked quickly down that road, constantly glancing over our shoulders. When we got back to the creek bed where we'd left our bikes, Eric suddenly stopped and pointed at something in the sand. "Look at that," he said. "I think it's a track." I never got a good look at whatever Eric saw. I was too busy scanning the trees around us. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it really was a track. I can't say for sure. All I know is that I wanted to get the hell out of there as fast as possible. As we grabbed our bikes, we both glanced up at the trees on the ridge we'd just come down from. I swear I saw something watching us from the shadows, a dark shape that seemed to shift slightly as I looked at it. Eric saw it too. I know because he didn't even try to get on his bike. He just started pushing it away from that spot as fast as he could walk, and I did the same. Once we were around the bend and out of sight of that area, we jumped on our bikes and pedaled harder than I've ever pedaled in my life. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, about 2 miles away. When we finally did stop, we were both gasping for breath. Neither of us said anything for a while. What could we say? We just stood there, straddling our bikes, trying to catch our breath. Finally, Eric looked at me and said, "You saw that, right? I'm not crazy." "I saw an arm and a leg," I told him, "covered in hair." Eric nodded. "I saw more," he said. "When you were looking at its arm, I could see part of its face." I remember feeling a chill run down my spine, despite the summer heat. "What did it look like?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know. "It looked human," Eric said, "but not human. Like a human face, but scary. And it was big, Jason, really big, like 7 feet tall at least. Based on the size of the arm and leg I saw, I believed him about the height. Whatever this thing was, it was massive. We debated whether to tell anyone. In the end, we decided not to. Who would believe us? We'd just get laughed at, or worse, get in trouble for trespassing on someone's land. So we made a pact to keep it to ourselves. Eric and I never went back to that part of the woods again. In fact, I didn't go exploring in any woods for the rest of that summer. Something about that encounter just took all the fun out of it. Looking back on it now, I still don't know exactly what we saw that day. Based on the hair, the height, the way it moved silently through the forest, I've come to believe it was what some people call a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. Before that day, I would have laughed at anyone who claimed to have seen such a thing. But I know what I saw. I know what Eric saw. And there's no way it was a bear, or some guy in a costume, or any of the other explanations people have suggested when I've rarely shared this story. No one goes hiking in the remote forests of Madison County in a hairy costume in the middle of summer. And the way it disappeared without a sound, no human could do that. The strangest part of all this is how it affected me afterward. For months, I had this feeling of being watched whenever I was outside. I'd find myself scanning the tree lines, looking for shapes that didn't belong. I'd listen extra carefully to the sounds of the forest, trying to detect that strange, unnatural pattern of movement I'd heard that day. I still get that feeling sometimes, even now, decades later. I'll be out in my backyard at dusk, and something will make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'll turn, expecting to see something watching me from the edge of the property, but there's never anything there. Eric moved away a couple years after our encounter. Last I heard, he was living in Texas. We don't keep in touch much anymore, but a few years ago, he called me out of the blue. We talked about old times, catching up on life, and eventually, he asked, "Remember that thing we saw in the woods that summer?" When I said yes, he just went quiet for a moment, then said, "I still think about it sometimes. Still gives me the creeps." Me too, Eric. Me too. I've spent a lot of time since then reading about similar encounters. There are a surprising number of them in the Ozarks and throughout Arkansas. Most people keep quiet about what they've seen, afraid of being ridiculed. I understand that fear all too well. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that day. Part of me still hopes to find a logical explanation, something that would make more sense than the existence of an unclassified primate species living in the forests of Arkansas. But another part of me knows what I saw. All I know for certain is that something was watching us from those woods that day. Something intelligent enough to hide itself. Something aware enough to stay still when it knew it had been spotted. Something smart enough to disappear without a trace when we looked away. And sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I wonder, is it still out there in those Madison County forests? And how many other people have seen it, but like me, were too afraid of ridicule to tell their story? I don't go exploring in remote woods anymore. Some things are better left undisturbed. And Drain. Story 13, Sicho. I still get chills typing this out, even though it's been almost 6 months. I've been lurking on this forum for weeks, reading everyone's experiences, trying to find the courage to share mine. I never believed in any of this stuff before. I was the kid who'd roll my eyes when my uncle would talk about something strange in those woods. Now I keep my blinds closed tight every night, and I still wake up sometimes feeling like I'm being watched. I'm 17, and my family lives out on River Ridge Road, about 25 miles outside of Oak Ridge, Oregon. Our property is basically surrounded by forest, thick Douglas firs and old growth that goes on for miles. Growing up here, I never thought about how isolated we really are. The nearest neighbor is the Hendersons, and they're almost a mile down the road. Most kids my age probably hate living so far from town, but I've always loved it. The stars at night are incredible. We have hiking trails right in our backyard, and I've got a decent internet connection for gaming. Or at least I did love it, until what happened that night. It was a Tuesday in January, around 1:30 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was up late scrolling through Reddit, despite having a calculus test the next day. My parents have this rule about devices after 11, but they're usually asleep by 10, so I've mastered the art of the silent night owl routine. My room is on the first floor, at the back of the house facing the tree line. We don't have any outdoor lighting back there because my dad says it disturbs the wildlife, and my mum likes watching deer from the kitchen window in the mornings. That night was particularly dark. No moon, overcast, the kind of country dark where you literally can't see your hand in front of your face. I was lying in bed with just my phone screen, lighting up my face, the blinds partially open because I like seeing the stars when they're out. I remember I was reading some thread about unexplained experiences when I got this weird feeling. It wasn't like a sudden chill or anything dramatic. It was more subtle, like when you walk into a room where people have just been talking about you. This feeling that something had shifted in the air around me. At first, I tried to ignore it. Our house makes all sorts of noises at night. The heating system, the old pipes, the wind through the trees. But this was different. The air felt heavy, pressurized, like right before a thunderstorm when everything gets still. Then I heard it, a soft thump against the side of the house. Not loud, not violent, just enough to make me pause my scrolling. It sounded almost like someone had bumped against the siding. We sometimes get raccoons or even the occasional black bear wandering around the property, so I wasn't immediately freaked out. I lowered my phone and turned my head toward the window, squinting into the darkness beyond the glass. The blinds were partly open, just enough for me to see a section of the yard and the tree line about 30 yards back. Nothing seemed out of place at first. Then I saw movement, something shifting in the darkness near my window. What happened next is still so vivid that sometimes I convince myself it was just a nightmare. But I know it wasn't. I know what I saw. A face appeared at my window. Not a human face, not an animal face either. At least not any animal I'd ever seen. It was massive, taking up almost the entire lower half of my window, which is about 5 feet off the ground. The skin looked leathery, weathered, with patches of dark hair, not fur, but hair, around what I guess you'd call its cheeks and forehead. But it was the eyes that made my blood turn to ice. They were huge, deep set in the skull, and unmistakably intelligent. They weren't animal eyes. They were looking at me with purpose, with curiosity. They were studying me. The creature blinked, slowly, deliberately, and then it huffed against the glass, creating a small cloud of condensation on my window. That's when I realized how close it was, that this thing was literally pressed up against my window, peering in at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My body just locked up completely, my phone forgotten in my hand. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Its nostrils flared, and I could see the glass fog up again with its breath. That's when I finally reacted. I didn't make a conscious decision to move. My body just sort of took over. I slid down under my blanket, pulling it over my head like I was 5 years old again, afraid of the monsters in my closet. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my ears, in my fingertips. I was absolutely certain that at any moment I'd hear the glass shatter and feel those massive hands grab me. I don't know how long I stayed there, paralyzed under my blanket. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 30. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. Finally, I gathered whatever scraps of courage I had left and peeked out from under the covers. The window was empty, just darkness beyond the glass. I didn't sleep at all that night. I turned on every light in my room and sat with my back against the headboard, knees pulled up to my chest, staring at that window until the sky began to lighten with dawn. I kept trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that I'd dozed off while reading creepy Reddit threads and given myself a nightmare. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. When my alarm went off at 6:30, I was still sitting there, exhausted and wired at the same time. I heard my parents moving around upstairs, going through their morning routines. My dad's heavy footsteps on the stairs, my mom turning on the coffee maker. Normal, everyday sounds that suddenly seemed so fragile, so insufficient against what might be out there. I waited until I heard my dad in the kitchen before I finally got out of bed. My legs were stiff and sore from being in the same position for hours. I moved cautiously to the window and closed the blinds completely before changing into jeans and a hoodie. I didn't want to look outside, not yet, but I knew I had to. When I finally walked into the kitchen, my mom took one look at me and asked if I was sick. I must have looked terrible, pale with dark circles under my eyes. I mumbled something about not sleeping well and grabbed a mug of coffee, which I never drink. My dad raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. After they both headed upstairs to get ready for work, I forced myself to go outside. The morning was cold and damp, a fine mist hanging between the trees. I walked slowly around to the back of the house, to my window. I was half expecting to find nothing, to confirm that it had all been in my head. But there they were, footprints, except they weren't like any footprints I'd ever seen. They were enormous, easily 15 inches long and incredibly wide, pressed deep into the mud beneath my window. They were barefoot, with 5 distinct toes, but proportioned all wrong for a human foot. And they were fresh. I followed them with my eyes. They led from the tree line to my window and then back toward the forest, disappearing among the undergrowth about 20 yards in. Whatever had made them was long gone, but it had definitely been there. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to take pictures. The footprints were so clear, so unmistakable. I took several shots from different angles, making sure to put my own foot next to one for scale. My size 10 shoe looked like a child's print next to it. When my parents came downstairs ready to leave, I showed my dad the photos and then took him outside to see for himself. He squinted at the prints for a long time, then shook his head. "Probably a bear," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. They sometimes stand on their hind legs to look around. The rain last night would have distorted the prints. But it hadn't rained, and bears don't have feet like that. Bears don't stand at windows, looking in with eyes that understand what they're seeing. Bears don't make you feel like you're being studied. I skipped school that day. After my parents left, I spent hours online, searching for anything that might explain what I'd seen. That's when I first came across descriptions of Sasquatch encounters. The height, the footprints, the behavior of watching humans from a distance, it all matched. I'd always thought Bigfoot was just a myth, something made up to sell merchandise and get TV ratings. But what if it wasn't? The next night, I pushed my dresser in front of my bedroom door and slept with a baseball bat beside my bed. I'm not ashamed to admit I left the lights on too. I didn't see anything that night or the next, but that feeling of being watched never quite went away. 3 nights after the incident, I was lying in bed with the blinds firmly closed, trying to fall asleep despite every noise making me jump. Around midnight, I heard something moving outside, not footsteps exactly, but a deliberate sound, like branches being carefully moved aside. It stopped right outside my window. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then very softly, I heard what sounded like sniffing, 3 long inhalations, as if something was testing the air. Then silence again. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared at the closed blinds, terrified that at any moment they would be torn away, and I'd see that face again. But nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of retreat. Branches moving, twigs snapping, growing fainter as whatever it was moved back toward the forest. I've never told anyone the full story except my best friend Mark, who looked at me like I was crazy. He suggested that maybe I'd been playing too many horror games, or that the isolation of living out in the woods was getting to me. But he wasn't there. He didn't see those eyes. The footprints were gone the next day, washed away by actual rain. The photos I took looked less convincing in daylight. They could be bear prints distorted by mud, like my dad said. But I know what I saw. It's been almost 6 months now, and I haven't seen the creature again. But sometimes, especially on dark nights when the wind is still, I get that same feeling. The heaviness in the air, the sense that something is out there, watching. I keep my blinds closed now, always. I've asked my parents about installing motion lights in the backyard, but they don't see the need. I'm counting down the months until college, when I can move to a dorm in the city, surrounded by concrete and streetlights and people. Sometimes I think about what might happen if it comes back, if it decides to do more than just look. Our doors aren't that strong. The windows are old. We're so isolated out here. And sometimes, on the edge of sleep, I remember those eyes, intelligent, curious, studying me through the glass, and I wonder what it wanted. Was it just curious? Was it trying to communicate something? Or was it sizing me up, deciding whether to break through that thin barrier between us? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. All I know is that there are things in these woods that most people will never see, things that exist in the shadows just beyond our understanding. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. You can never go back to believing the world is exactly as you thought it was. So that's my story. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I wouldn't have believed it myself 6 months ago, but it happened. And now, every time I hear a twig snap outside my window or feel that heaviness in the air, I know it's still out there, watching, waiting for what I don't know, and that's what terrifies me the most. Story 14. I've never been one to believe in the unexplainable. Growing up in Joplin, I was raised with both feet firmly planted on the ground, attending church on Sundays and working at the hardware store part-time during high school. William was the same way, practical, logical, a man who fixed problems with his hands and didn't waste time on fantasy. We built our life on that solid foundation, raised our beautiful Emma, and planned for a quiet retirement, watching her grow her own family someday. But that was before Before the tornado took our Emma 6 years ago. Before we sold our house with all its memories. Before we bought the RV, and certainly before that third night in Yosemite when everything I thought I understood about the world changed forever. I'm sharing this now because I need someone to believe me. William and I have barely spoken about it since it happened 4 months ago, but I see how it's changed him, how he jumps at sounds in the night, how he keeps that baseball bat by the bed now, how he insists we park in established campgrounds with other people nearby. It was late May, and we'd been on the road for just over 2 years. The nomadic lifestyle suited us. No roots meant no painful memories attached to empty bedrooms or photograph-lined walls. We could run from our grief, at least for a while, as we chased sunsets across America. We'd spent a week in Yosemite Valley proper, but the crowds were getting to us. Too many tourists asking where we were from, what we did before retirement, if we had any kids. Questions that felt like knives. So we moved to a more remote spot just outside the park boundaries, on national forest land, where you can legally boondock for up to 14 days. It was beautiful there. Our campsite backed up to a dense forest of pines and sequoias, with mountains rising behind them. During the day, we hiked the unmarked trails, took photographs, read books in our camp chairs. At night, the stars were magnificent without the light pollution. For the first time in months, I felt peace. That third night, we went to bed around 10. I remember checking the weather app before turning in. Clear skies, temperatures dropping to the mid-40s overnight. William locked up, as he always did. We had a routine: check all doors, windows, make sure the propane was turned off, stow the food in sealed containers to keep from attracting bears. We weren't naive about wilderness safety. I fell asleep quickly, but woke suddenly at 2:17 in the morning. I remember the time precisely because I checked my phone immediately, thinking it was morning already. Something had jolted me awake. Not a noise exactly, but a movement. The RV had shuddered, like someone had bumped into it. "William," I whispered, nudging him. "Did you feel that?" He grunted and rolled over, still mostly asleep. Then it happened again, stronger this time. The entire RV rocked slightly, as if caught in a gust of wind. But there was no wind. The night was perfectly still. "William!" I hissed more urgently, sitting up now, pulse quickening. He sat up too, instantly alert. "What was that?" "I don't know. Something hit the RV." We both froze, listening. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then came a scraping sound along the passenger side, like something dragging against the metal exterior. "Bear," William whispered, reaching for his glasses. "Probably a black bear. They're common here." That made sense. Bears sometimes investigated vehicles looking for food, but something felt wrong about this. The scraping continued, moving from the back of the RV toward the front, but it was too high up. We were in a 28-foot Class C motorhome. The sound was at least 7 feet off the ground. Then the entire RV started to rock, not violently, but rhythmically, like something was pushing against it, testing its stability. My first thought was earthquake, but this didn't feel like the ground moving. It felt like something was manipulating our vehicle. William climbed out of bed, pulling on his jeans. "Stay here," he ordered, but I wasn't about to let him investigate alone. I grabbed my robe and followed him to the front of the RV. The movement continued, becoming more pronounced. Items started falling from shelves: books, a coffee mug, our little battery-powered clock. Whatever was out there was strong enough to shift a 7-ton vehicle. William slid into the driver's seat, his face pale in the moonlight filtering through the windshield. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "Scaring it off," he replied, and before I could stop him, he pressed the horn. The blaring sound cut through the night, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. No movement, no sounds, just stillness. "See," William said, "just a bear. It's gone now." But it wasn't gone. A deep, rumbling sound came from directly outside, not quite a growl, more like a breathing, heavy, rhythmic breathing, like something massive trying to contain its rage. Then the RV moved again, not a gentle rocking this time. The front end lifted up, tilting us backward. I grabbed the kitchenette counter to keep from falling as the angle increased. Dishes crashed in the cabinets. Our small TV tore free from its mount and smashed onto the floor. "Jesus Christ!" William shouted, bracing himself against the steering wheel. "What the hell is happening?" The front tires must have been at least 2 feet off the ground. Through the windshield, all I could see was the night sky where trees should have been. Then, as suddenly as it started, the RV dropped back down, bouncing hard on its suspension. The impact knocked William sideways. He stumbled, trying to catch himself on the passenger seat, but his foot came down on the broken television screen. He cried out, falling backward. "I'm cut!" he gasped, lifting his foot to reveal a deep gash in his heel, blood already pooling on the linoleum. I moved to help him, but froze when a shadow passed across the windshield, massive and hunched. Not a bear, not anything I recognized. "Don't move," William whispered, his eyes fixed on something outside the passenger window. I couldn't help myself. I turned to look. A face was pressed against the glass. Not a human face, not an animal face I'd ever seen. It was covered in dark, matted fur, with a wide, flat nose like a gorilla's, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off. The eyes were set too far apart, reflective in the darkness like a deer's eyes in headlights, but intelligent, watching, calculating. I couldn't scream, couldn't breathe, could only stare back at this impossible thing studying us through the window. Its breath fogged the glass as it exhaled, hot and heavy. I could see huge teeth partially exposed by lips, pulled back in what might have been aggression or curiosity. William reached slowly for my hand, gripping it so tightly it hurt. "Don't make a sound," he mouthed. The creature tilted its head, still watching. Then it moved away from the window, but I could hear it circling the RV, its footsteps heavy on the pine needles covering the ground. It was walking upright. I know that sounds crazy, but the footsteps were distinct, heel to toe like a human, not the padding of a bear. "Get the bear spray," William whispered. "It's not a bear," I replied, my voice barely audible. "Whatever it is, get the goddamn spray." I moved as quietly as possible to the cabinet where we kept emergency supplies. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the canister, the metallic clang seeming impossibly loud in the silence. Everything stopped again. No footsteps, no breathing outside, just the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. Then something hit the roof, hard. The impact dented the metal inward slightly above our heads, then another hit, and another. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like Morse code or some kind of communication. William had managed to wrap a t-shirt around his bleeding foot, but I could see the red stain spreading. He looked terrified in a way I'd never seen before, not even when we'd faced hurricanes back home. "We need to start the engine," he said, his voice steadier than I expected. "Drive out of here. What if it's in front of us? What if there are more of them?" The thought had clearly never occurred to him. His face went even paler. The pounding on the roof stopped, replaced by scraping sounds. Something heavy dragged across the top of the RV, causing the entire structure to creak and flex. Then came what I can only describe as vocalizations. Not growls or animal sounds exactly, more like speech. I know how that sounds, but it's the only way to describe it. A series of rapid clicks, deep whooping calls, and something resembling words, but in no language I've ever heard. The cadence was wrong for animal sounds. Too purposeful, too varied. And then, from the darkness of the forest beyond our campsite, came an answer. The same types of sounds, but from at least 2 different sources. They were communicating. Whatever was on our roof was talking to others in the trees. William's eyes met mine, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. We weren't dealing with one creature. We were surrounded. "The windows," he whispered urgently. "Make sure all the blinds are closed. Don't let them see us moving around." I went through the RV, pulling down the few blinds that weren't already closed. When I reached the bedroom window at the very back, I hesitated before touching the blind. What if one of them was right outside? What if I pulled the blind down and saw another face staring back at me? Gathering my courage, I quickly yanked it down. Nothing was visible except darkness, but I had the overwhelming sense of being watched. The strange communication continued, growing more agitated. I returned to William, who had retrieved the baseball bat we kept under the bed. "What do they want?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. William shook his head. "I don't know, but they're not getting in here." We both knew that was a lie. If they wanted in, they could tear through the thin walls of our home like paper. We'd seen the strength when they lifted the front end. The creatures seemed to be moving around our campsite now. I could hear them manipulating objects, our camp chairs, the portable table we'd left outside, the plastic storage bin containing firewood. Curious, almost childlike investigation. For nearly an hour this continued. We didn't dare move or speak, just sat huddled in the kitchen area, listening. William's foot had stopped bleeding, but he was clearly in pain. I was numb with terror, my mind unable to process what was happening. Then the first light of dawn began to filter through the blinds, and suddenly the sounds stopped. The last thing we heard was a series of those deep whooping calls fading into the forest, followed by the crack of branches as something large moved through the trees. We waited another half hour before William cautiously peeled back one of the blinds to look outside. "They're gone," he said finally, his voice hoarse. It took me several attempts to stand on my trembling legs. William limped to the door, bat still in hand, and slowly opened it. Morning light revealed our campsite in disarray. The chairs were broken, the table flipped over, but what made my stomach churn were the footprints. Dozens of them, surrounding the RV in patterns suggesting multiple creatures had been circling us. They were footprints, not paw prints. Unmistakably feet with 5 toes, but massive, easily 18 inches long. The impression in the soft earth was deep, suggesting whatever made them was extraordinarily heavy. "William," I called weakly, pointing to the side of the RV. Long, dark strands of hair were caught in a seam in the metal siding. Not bare fur, which is short and thick. This was long, coarse, almost like human hair, but not quite. And the smell. Dear God, the smell. Like wet dog combined with something musky and primal. It hung in the air around our campsite, making me gag. But the most disturbing discovery was the pile of excrement left prominently in what had been the center of our camp. I'm embarrassed to be sharing this detail, but it's important. It wasn't random animal droppings. It had been deliberately placed there, like a message or a warning. William, ever the practical one despite his ashen face, took photos of everything, the footprints, the hair, even collected a sample of the excrement in a plastic bag. "We need to report this," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The ranger station or someone." We both knew what would happen if we did. They'd assume it was a bear, despite the evidence. Or worse, they'd think we were crazy. Who would believe us? Instead, William drove us to the nearest urgent care to get his foot properly cleaned and bandaged. I told the nurse he'd stepped on broken glass while getting water during the night. A normal, believable accident. We sent the hair and excrement samples to a private laboratory, claiming we were doing amateur research on wildlife. We never received results. Our emails and calls went unanswered after the initial intake. That was 4 months ago. We've continued our travels, but something fundamental has changed. We don't talk about that night, but its presence lingers between us like an invisible passenger in our RV. I've spent countless hours researching since then, learning about documented sightings across North America, reading accounts from people who've had similar experiences, people who are typically dismissed as attention seekers or mentally unstable. I know what we encountered. I know the word for it, though I still can't bring myself to say it out loud. It sounds too absurd, too impossible. But I know what I saw looking through that window. I know what I heard communicating in the darkness. We're currently in Idaho, far from where it happened. But some nights, when we're parked somewhere quiet and the wind moves through the trees, I swear I can hear those whooping calls in the distance. And I lie awake wondering if they're following us. Or worse, if they're everywhere, watching from forests across America, mostly unseen, but occasionally making themselves known to people like us. People who will never be the same again. I don't expect you to believe me. I wouldn't have believed it myself before that night. But I needed to tell someone. I needed to put it in words before the details start to fade, before I convince myself it was just a nightmare. It wasn't a nightmare. The scar on William's heel proves that. And the way he still checks the RV locks 3 times every night, and how neither of us can bear to camp anywhere without the safety of other people nearby. Whatever is out there in the wilderness, it's more intelligent and more organized than most people realize. And it knows we're here. Story 15. For context, I've been living in my van for about 8 months now. Not because I'm down on my luck or anything, but because I wanted freedom. I was stuck in this soul-crushing marketing job in Chicago, spending my days in a cubicle watching my life tick away. So I saved up, bought a 2008 Sprinter, converted it myself, YouTube tutorials are amazing, quit my job, and hit the road. Best decision I ever made, until that night in Washington State. I was making my way down from Olympic National Park, taking my time, enjoying the scenery. The forests up there are something else, so dense and green it almost hurts your eyes. I'd been driving most of the day and started looking for somewhere to camp around 6 in the evening. I prefer to find spots before dark, you know. I turned onto this unmarked Forest Service road about 30 miles east of Aberdeen. It was gravelly, winding through these massive trees, and I was thinking I'd struck gold. No designated campgrounds nearby meant no fees, no neighbors, just me and nature, the kind of spot van lifers dream about. About 2 miles down this road, I found a small clearing that was perfect. It wasn't an official site, no firing or anything, but it was flat enough for sleeping and surrounded by these enormous firs and cedars. I could hear a creek somewhere nearby, and the late afternoon light was filtering through the trees. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. I parked, made dinner on my little propane stove, just some pasta with canned sauce, and sat outside on my camp chair reading until it got too dark. Nothing unusual. I didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird or the sound of the wind in the trees. I climbed into my van around 9, locked up and got into bed. I've got a platform bed in the back with storage underneath, and I was cozy as hell. I fell asleep easily enough. I usually sleep pretty well in the van. Something about the confined space makes me feel secure. I woke up at what must have been around 2 in the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. My phone was next to me on the little shelf I built, and I checked the time. 1:56 a.m. I laid there for a minute listening, thinking maybe it was just the wind or an animal scurrying around outside. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps on the forest floor. At first I thought maybe it was a deer or an elk. I've camped in enough forests to know that wildlife is active at night, but these footsteps, they were different. They had a rhythm to them that seemed too measured, too intentional to be a 4-legged animal. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. Like whatever it was taking careful individual steps, and they were getting closer to my van. I sat up in bed, still groggy but with adrenaline starting to kick in. I thought about turning on my headlamp but decided against it. I didn't want to attract attention to myself if it was a person out there. Who would be walking around the forest at 2 a.m.? Nothing good came to mind. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I held my breath. My van has curtains over all the windows for privacy, so I couldn't see out without moving them aside. I was debating whether to peek when the footsteps started again, this time circling around to the passenger side of my van. That's when I heard the first vocalization. It wasn't a human sound. It wasn't quite an animal sound either, at least not like any animal I've heard before. It was this deep, throaty growl that turned into something like a snort. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I stayed absolutely still, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps continued around the back of the van, and I could hear sniffing, like something was actively smelling the exterior of my vehicle. Deep, powerful inhales that I could hear clearly from inside. I had this stupid thought that maybe it was a bear. But bears don't walk on two legs for extended periods, and this thing was tall. The sniffing sounds were coming from much higher up than a bear would be. Suddenly, the whole van shifted slightly as something bumped against the rear doors. Not violently, but firmly enough to rock the vehicle. I nearly pissed myself. Whatever was out there was strong. I reached for my phone thinking I should call someone, but who? 911? I was miles from the nearest paved road. Help would take forever to arrive. And what would I even say? There's something outside my van. They'd ask what it was, and I didn't know. The footsteps continued around to the driver's side now. Slow, methodical. I could hear breathing, deep, raspy breathing, and occasional snorts. Then there was a weird sound, like fingers dragging along the metal exterior of the van. The sound traveled from the back all the way to the front. I was sitting in my bed, knees pulled up to my chest, entire body trembling. I've never felt fear like that before. It was primal. Every instinct was screaming danger. Then my van rocked as something hit the driver's side door with a loud thunk. Not like it was trying to get in, but like it was testing the vehicle, or marking it. The impact was so forceful that my water bottle fell off my little shelf. That was it. I had to get out of there. My keys were in the little dish by the front seats. I would have to climb over my kitchen counter to reach the driver's seat. The thought of moving, of making noise, terrified me, but staying put seemed worse. I slowly, silently moved my blanket aside and started to crawl forward. Every tiny sound, the rustle of my sleeping bag, my knee pressing on the wooden platform, seemed amplified in the silence. Outside, the footsteps had stopped. Whatever it was standing still by the driver's door. I could hear its breathing, in, out, deep, powerful breaths. I reached the kitchen counter and carefully climbed over it, placing my feet silently on the floor of the cab. I slid into the driver's seat, feeling exposed, even though the curtains were drawn. My hands were shaking so badly I fumbled with the keys. Something pressed against the driver's side window, not hard, just there, like it was leaning in, listening. I could hear the faint squeak of skin or something against the glass. I didn't dare look. I kept my eyes locked forward, focusing on getting the key in the ignition. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Immediately, the thing outside let out a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a scream. It was both and neither. It was primal and furious and shocked all at once. The volume was incredible. It filled the van. It filled my head. I didn't hesitate. I threw the van into drive and hit the gas. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I shot forward. In my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of something, a large, dark shape moving quickly away from the van. I didn't get a clear look, just an impression of height and mass that seemed impossible. I drove like hell down that forest road, bouncing over ruts and rocks, branches scraping the sides of my home on wheels. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, and even then, I kept going until I saw streetlights in the distance. I pulled into the first gas station I found, this 24-hour place outside of some small town, and just sat there, engine running, trying to stop shaking. When I finally calmed down enough to think clearly, I realized two things. One, I needed to check my van for damage, and two, I was absolutely not going back into those woods. I got out, legs still wobbly, and walked around the vehicle. When I got to the driver's side door, I froze. There was a dent, a significant basketball-sized depression in the metal, and within that dent was what looked like a smudged, muddy handprint. Except it wasn't a human hand. It was massive, with what appeared to be 5 distinct fingers, but proportioned all wrong. Too big, too wide. I touched it hesitantly and pulled my hand back immediately. It wasn't just mud, it was sticky and had this smell, which made me notice that my entire van reeked of this musky, sour odor, like wet animal fur mixed with something rotting. I went inside the gas station and bought cleaning supplies. The attendant must have thought I was crazy, this wild-eyed guy at 3 in the morning buying paper towels and disinfectant spray, but I needed to get that residue off my van. I scrubbed the handprint away, but the dent remains. The smell took 3 days to finally dissipate, even with the windows open and driving at highway speeds. I slept in Walmart parking lots for the next week, too scared to camp anywhere remote. I've been trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've researched online, and yeah, I know what it sounds like, but I was never a believer in that kind of thing before. I'm still not sure I am now. All I know is that whatever was outside my van that night wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't anything I can rationally explain. Sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear those footsteps again. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause, getting closer in the darkness. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't started the engine when I did, if it had gotten the door open somehow. I'm still continuing my cross-country trip. I'm still living in my van. But something changed that night. I don't feel the same freedom I once did. I'm constantly checking my mirrors, constantly aware of the thinness of the metal walls that separate me from whatever might be out there. And I never, ever camp alone in dense forests anymore, especially not in the Pacific Northwest. The dent is still there. I should get it fixed, but some part of me doesn't want to. It's evidence that I didn't imagine it, that something impossible reached out and touched my life for a brief, terrifying moment. I just wish I knew what it was. Or maybe I don't. Maybe it's better not knowing for sure, because if what I suspect is true, then everything I thought I knew about the world is wrong, and the forests are a lot less empty than we think they are.